It took a millennium to create the European miracle, and a single month to destroy it. The First World War was, in George Kennan's words, the seminal catastrophe of the 20th century. In 1914, this minuscule patch of earth called Europe was the richest, most advanced, creative, industrious and innovative civilization in human history. Its influence around the globe on everything from culture and language, finance and commerce to political systems and military standards was immense. That year, the continent was celebrating nearly a century of peace and prosperity. There had still been smaller, shorter wars, but those apocalyptic clashes between the great powers that had characterised so much of Europe's history before 1815 seemed to have been overcome. Every generation was richer than the last, healthier, happier, better fed. Each year some new scientific advancement, the telephone and motor car, the aeroplane or electricity, drew awe from around the world. The energy was young, ambitious and self-confident. And then it all went wrong. In 4 grueling years, Europe tore itself apart, fighting the most disastrous war humanity had yet witnessed. The immediate reason European civilization flung itself into the abyss is elusively simple. In June 1914, the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, travelled to the remote town of Sarajevo. There, he and his wife were assassinated by a young Bosnian Serb. These fatal shots, fired at point-blank range by a sickly teenager in a poor and unknown corner of the Balkans, sparked the conflagration that set the world ablaze. Yet what remains fascinating about the First World War is that almost nobody expected it in 1914. Without Franz Ferdinand's assassination, the year would have passed peacefully. If there was to be a war that summer, informed contemporary opinion anticipated a small, localised one between Greece and the Ottoman Empire on the southern edge of Europe, not a clash across the whole continent involving millions of men. This then begs the question, why did the assassination of an Austrian archduke in a remote Balkan town so abruptly end the long peace in 1914? The answer, as I'm sure you can tell from this documentary's length, is not so simple. But to tell the story, we have to go back. Roughly 40 years back. Now, the big change you'll notice is Germany, at this point divided between 5 different states. Then, just 1 year on, and that was almost solely down to the work of this man, Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck's origins were relatively obscure. He'd been raised as a middling Prussian Junker, the landed aristocracy that dominated much of the kingdom's politics. Astonishingly tall for the time period, he ate and drank on a gargantuan scale. With his thick moustache and bushy eyebrows, Disraeli wrote to Queen Victoria that he resembled an ogre in appearance. But he had a fine, little head, delicate hands, and most surprisingly, a thin and reedy voice rather than the deep and booming echo one might have expected. Appallingly cynical, boundlessly resourceful, and utterly ruthless, he was also a witty and charming conversationalist, regularly wept in public, inspired devoted loyalty and admiration even from his enemies. No one in Berlin or any other European court could ever quite get the measure of this half-mad Prussian. He was consequently shunted from posting to posting in his early diplomatic career, seemingly destined for little more than a comfortable ambassadorship in Paris. When he surprised everyone with his sudden appointment as Minister-President, head of the Prussian government in 1862, it was only because of a full-blown constitutional crisis between the king and the nation's parliament, the Landtag. Wilhelm, a conservative, wanted to implement major reforms to the Prussian army, the most contentious of which was a 3-year service law for conscripts. But that required money, which the Landtag, controlled by liberals opposed to royal power, refused to give. That the king turned to Bismarck and accepted the maverick's demands for total control over the government was a sign of how desperate he was. The new minister-president's solution to the crisis was to use a loophole in the constitution that allowed him to collect the previous year's taxes without the Landtag's consent. This plan went down like a cup of cold sick. The army reform was implemented, but the liberals were furious, and the king seemed ready to offer them Bismarck's head in response. Military reform, though, had only ever been a means to an end for Bismarck. The Prussia he had inherited was the weakest of the 5 great powers in Europe. Since the time of Napoleon, almost every attempt to play the game of international politics had invariably ended in complete humiliation. For Bismarck, his job was not just to help the king, he was there to make Prussia great, and he knew how to do it. For about 100 years there had been this idea of German nationalism, the concept of a united identity that bound all of the peoples in the German-speaking states together. Maybe there should even be a single country for them, instead of all these tiny principalities. In 1848 there had been a wave of popular revolutions that had sought to make this a reality, but they'd failed spectacularly. The monarchies that actually ruled the German states had basically wanted nothing to do with it, and the monarchs controlled all of the armies, without which, no Germany. Bismarck's idea was, rather than trying to unify Germany with revolutions or democratic votes, why not do it with the Prussian army? So, in September 1862, as he's locked in confrontation with liberal politicians over the military budget, Bismarck goes to the Landtag and says, not through speeches and majority decisions will the great questions of the day be decided. That was the great mistake of 1848 and 1849, but by iron and blood. Now, as it happened, Bismarck actually regretted making the speech. All it did at the time was further annoy the liberals, who weren't ecstatic to hear the money they hadn't granted was going to be used in wars they didn't want. But the minister-president had meant what he said, and he was about to prove it. In 1864, the Danish king tried to annex the Duchy of Schleswig, a state he technically ruled already, but was claimed by a German prince along with the Duchy of Holstein, a state that was actually in the German Confederation. Confusing? Everybody else thought so as well. You've probably heard this famous quote from the British Prime Minister about the question. All that's really important to know is that Bismarck used the issue as a pretext for war, and in a quick campaign recovered both duchies for the German Confederation. Then he turned on Austria. The Habsburg emperors in Vienna had been Germany's overlords for nearly half a millennia. It took the newly reformed Prussian army 7 weeks to bring them to their knees. In the aftermath, Bismarck dissolved the German Confederation and forced every principality above the River Main into a Prussian-led union, annexing them in all but name. Back home, the once overwhelming liberal bloc that had prayed daily for Bismarck's fall now joined the celebrations in the wake of his triumph. Soon after, they agreed to a compromise backdating the overwhelmingly successful army reforms in return for a freely given promise from the minister-president to never bypass them again. "I've beaten them all," Bismarck declared, hammering his fist on the desk. The only remaining problem was the southern German kingdoms, too big to be coerced like Saxony, too small to be left alone like Austria, too German to be omitted from any unification, too Catholic to willingly join with the Protestant North. Bismarck needed an outside threat, something that would convince the southern Germans to look to Berlin for protection, and in France he found one. The French had been alarmed by Prussia's sudden rise to power, and when, in a relatively complex bit of diplomatic manoeuvring, it looked as if the Prussians might also place a Hohenzollern relative of their king on the throne of Spain, Paris put its foot down. Now, when the French ambassador demanded King Wilhelm retract the proposed candidacy, he actually agreed, but Bismarck then edited the telegram reporting the king's reply to make it seem as if he had insulted the French ambassador. In Paris, the people demanded war. In Berlin, they demanded war, and Bismarck had his war. The French were in no way ready for a conflict, and it again took the Prussians little over a month to surround and destroy the main French army. Believing France to have been the aggressor, the southern German states also rallied to Prussia's side. Glory proved a powerful intoxicant, and in the Palace of Versailles, all of the German princes gathered to proclaim Wilhelm as Kaiser, Emperor. Soon after, Paris fell to German armies following a bloody 4-month siege. The beaten French government sued for peace. The terms of the Treaty of Frankfurt were harsher than those imposed on Austria. France was to pay a 5 billion franc indemnity. Until then, the German army would occupy much of the country's north. Most humiliatingly though, the new Reich also seized the border provinces of Alsace-Lorraine. The states had large German-speaking communities and were considered a necessity by the army if the new nation was to have militarily defensible frontiers. For the French though, still drunk on the glories of Bonaparte, it was as if a limb had been amputated. Bismarck had, in a decade, proved himself more worthy an heir to Frederick's crown than any Hohenzollern king had in a century. Prussia from last to first in Europe, the once squabbling German states forged into a formidable new empire. Nietzsche's will to power embodied in the actions and ambitions of a single man. But triumph inevitably created the conditions for the fall. Since Louis XIV, 200 years earlier, France had been the continent's most powerful country. To now have that position usurped was a devastating geopolitical change the country wouldn't take lightly, and it wasn't just France that was concerned. In the House of Commons, the future Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli announced the new Reich was a German revolution, a greater political event than the French Revolution of the last century. The balance of power has been entirely destroyed. Bismarck was no fool. He understood that such a powerful new country would be seen as a threat by the four other great powers of Europe, and so, now elevated to the position of Chancellor, he set out to make peace rather than war. The diplomatic system Bismarck created assumed that France, resentful at its lost power and provinces, would always be hostile. Germany alone, with its larger army and economy, could beat the French in a straight fight, but if France found allies, different question. The solution was for Berlin to block off this possibility. For the next 15 years, Europe was dominated by the Three Emperors League, a quasi-alliance between Germany, Austria-Hungary and Russia. These three empires were ruled by monarchs who shared a vested interest in maintaining the European status quo against the likes of France, which had become a republic after the recent war. But whilst a flash of tricolour from Marianne could bring all the boys to the yard, the League was not actually an alliance in the traditional sense. There was no commitment to go to war on behalf of another member, for example. For the Germans, though, it meant France would at least remain isolated. Bismarck had foreseen the need to cultivate relationships with Russia and Austria from the very beginning. Back in 1863, he'd supported the Tsar's ruthless suppression of a rebellion in Russian-owned Poland. Then, in 1871, had given his okay to Petersburg's renouncement of the Black Sea clauses, limits placed on the Russian Navy after the Crimean War 15 years earlier. Austria should have been more complicated. Prussia had, after all, only just fought her for control of Germany. But following their victory at the Battle of Königgrätz, Bismarck had argued bitterly against taking any territory from Austria directly, even threatening to resign if King Wilhelm marched on Vienna as he had wanted to. The leniency of this settlement was to allow for the quick reconciliation that occurred. All politics reduced themselves to this formula, Bismarck said. Try to be a trois in a world governed by five powers. Theoretically, the Three Emperors League meant Germany was part of a strong alliance that kept it safe from potential threats. Practically though, it was a fair-weather friendship, and the flaws began to appear quickly. France, which had just been beaten to her knees, surprised everyone by the speed with which she recovered. The massive financial indemnity levied against her was paid off in 3 years, so rapidly it contributed towards an economic crisis in the entire Western world. The military that had been wrecked so badly was completely overhauled through a series of major reforms, whilst the politics of the country became intently focused on reclaiming the lost provinces. All of this scared the Germans, and in 1875, a newspaper close to the government published an editorial declaring that war was in sight. This was taken throughout Europe to be evidence of Bismarck testing the waters, sounding out what the German public's reaction would be to a new war aimed at stopping France's recovery. In response, both Britain and Russia warned Berlin that they would not allow this type of aggressive conflict again. The reality is the leak probably did not come from Bismarck, who remained committed to peace, and this faux crisis went nowhere, but it showed that Germany was still seen as a threat, even by its own ally. Indeed, Bismarck's whole strategy of isolating France was riddled with problems. He held that a republic in Paris was the best guarantee of peace on the Rhine. Whilst France was democratic, no monarch would dare ally with her. To this end, he destroyed the career of Germany's extremely talented ambassador, Harry von Arnim, a conservative that was trying to promote a monarchist restoration in France as the best policy for Europe. Bismarck was more interested in what was best for Germany, but his ideas were flawed. It was hardly like Thiers or McMahon, the two French presidents that rebuilt the country throughout the 1870s, were Robespierre and Danton come again. Even if they had been, as would be shown 20 years later, the monarchs of Europe were quite prepared to abandon their principles of conservative solidarity if it served their national interests anyway. In fact, the real challenge to Bismarck's system wasn't his enemies, it was his allies. Austria and Russia, to put it mildly, were not on great terms with one another. They had come close to actually fighting during the Crimean War, and both empires vied for influence in the Balkan Peninsula. In 1877, Russia went to war with the Ottoman Empire, which still dominated much of the region, ostensibly to protect the large Christian population that was then facing abuse at the hands of the Turks. This was just another part in what was then called the Eastern Question, the debate between the European powers over what to do with Turkey, which was in terminal decline as a power and widely referred to as the sick man of Europe. The Russians had tended to hope for the empire's destruction, believing they would profit from it territorially, and after slogging their way to the gates of Constantinople at the cost of an immense amount of men and money, they forced the Ottomans to sign a preliminary peace agreement that completely reordered the Balkans, with a large new Bulgarian state that would inevitably remain a Russian vassal. Such a disintegration of Turkish power and growth of St. Petersburg's horrified both the Austrians and the British, who threatened war in response. To prevent the destruction of his entire diplomatic system, Bismarck offered to set himself up as an honest broker and host a Congress of the European powers in Berlin to settle the matter. The result was a new treaty that substantially reduced Russian gains in the war and saved the Ottoman Empire from collapse, but also set up several new Balkan states. Still, the dispute basically shattered the Three Emperors League. Bismarck was terrified by how close Europe had come to war in 1878 and the breakdown in communication between the Habsburg and Romanov empires. Previously, he had been more interested in peace as a way of securing Germany's power and prestige. Whilst this continued to be his driving aim, from 1879 onwards, his position in the European system is often seen as becoming more conservative than before, determined to secure a general peace for the continent's sake, rather than just Germany's alone. It was the moment when Germany accepted the full responsibilities of a great power, was A.J.P. Taylor's analysis. To do so, Bismarck's diplomatic web became even more complex. He signed with Austria-Hungary a new treaty, this time a formal alliance committing Germany to go to war on her behalf if she were attacked by Russia. For Bismarck, though, the actual purpose of the alliance was restraining Vienna's ambitions in the Balkans and badgering her into a settlement once more with Russia. The higher level Bismarck was playing at here can be seen in the argument he had with Wilhelm I over the treaty. To the septuagenarian monarch, the alliance with Austria seemed like a needless provocation of the Russians, who were neither threatening nor even hostile to Germany. And to an extent he had a point. 25 years earlier, Prussia had briefly entered a short-lived alliance with Austria. Bismarck, then a young diplomat, had complained of tying the trim Prussian frigate to a worm-eaten Austrian galleon. The disparity remained the same, indeed if anything it was more visible in 1879. But Bismarck thought the treaty would give Germany a say over Austrian policy, prevent her from seeking alliance with France or Britain, and restrain Vienna's more aggressive tendencies in the Balkans. In the short term, it worked. In the long, it was an assessment that was to take both empires to their doom. Although Wilhelm had worried that the treaty with Austria would permanently alienate his nephew, the Emperor of Russia, the reality was that St. Petersburg, broke and vulnerable after the Turkish War, still needed good relations with Germany. Thus, following a bit of diplomatic manoeuvring, Bismarck was able to badger them into signing up for a new Three Emperors League. Like before, it was not a formal alliance, and did not cancel out the Austro-German treaty. All the League did was promise neutrality if one of the powers was attacked by another party. If Bismarck's perennial fear of a Franco-German war came true, for example, Vienna and St. Petersburg would not stab Berlin in the back. The Russians and Austrians also agreed to take account of each other's interests in the Balkan Peninsula. And for the next quarter of a century, cooperation, self-restraint and informal spheres of influence would generally keep this tinderbox relatively quiet. For Bismarck, it meant he had once again avoided the possibility of a two-front war, and brought the opposing forces of Habsburg and Romanov together. Peace on the continent, for as long as the League lasted, seemed assured. The following year, Italy joined the Austro-German Pact, turning it into a triple alliance. Like Germany, the Italians were a recently unified nation, and this treaty was yet another step in Bismarck's isolation of France, which was now totally quarantined. If we zoom out, we can see what an intricate web of overlapping secret agreements, treaties and deals this was. The key thing to emphasise though, is that whilst it worked for now, all of them had a single point of failure, namely Otto von Bismarck. It was Bismarck who kept this convoluted system together, and for all his guile, problems still abounded. Of these, the Balkans remained the most persistent thorn, and the main reason for that was the slowly dying empire to his south. In Christopher Clark's words, two military disasters defined the trajectory of the Habsburg Empire for the last half-century of its existence. In 1859, Austria had lost the bloody Battle of Solferino to a Franco-Piedmontese army, and with it the rich Italian province of Lombardy. Venice would follow soon after, ejecting Vienna from all remaining influence in the peninsula, whilst Piedmont drove on to forge a unified Italian state. Then, in 1866, Prussia had destroyed Austria's hold on Germany with a crushing victory at Königgrätz. Habsburg power over Central Europe, dominant for half a millennium, was wiped out in a single day. What was left of the Austrian Empire seemed an uninspiring rump, rather than a nation-state like France or Germany, containing a single dominant ethnicity. The Habsburg realms were an eclectic mix of races, nationalities and creeds. Germans, Italians, Czechs, Magyars, Slavs, Poles, Romanians and Ruthenians, held together only by the ancient and creaking visage that was the House of Habsburg. If this sounds complicated to you, it was far more so for the imperial administration in Vienna trying to work out how to rule this unwieldy conglomerate at the dawn of the 20th century. Bismarck was forging Germany into the most powerful nation on the continent. The Habsburgs were trying to work out which language was spoken in Stropkov. The defeat of 1866 had transformed the empire. In its aftermath, an Austrian government, until then ruled by Germans from Vienna, agreed to a compromise with the second largest ethnicity, the Magyars. They would rule a reborn kingdom of Hungary, dominant in the east, whilst Vienna continued to govern the west. Politicians, of course, famously enjoy sharing their power. For practical purposes, this new order is often referred to as the Austro-Hungarian Empire, though the name is something of a misnomer. As far as the Magyars were concerned, their kingdom was a completely independent state. That the Emperor of Austria was also King of Hungary was a mere coincidence. In reality, of course, there had to be some connecting ministries. Foreign affairs and defence, including a joint army, continued to link the two halves of this odd realm. But the disjointed nature of the political arrangement would cause endless problems for Austrian foreign policy. The Hungarians were always fearful of Vienna reasserting its control over them in the future, and to combat this purposely kneecapped military spending increases, leaving the Habsburg army to fall behind its European peers. This to the extent that Britain, with a much smaller force made up entirely of volunteers, was soon outspending Austria's larger army founded upon conscription. More extravagant Hungarian demands, though, were usually blocked if the emperor threatened to introduce universal suffrage in the kingdom. Rule by minorities and peasants was even more anathema to the small crop of Magyar landholders that dominated the Hungarian government than Austrian control would have been. The situation was more tolerable for the other minorities of the empire. Those that fell under the rule of the Austrian half continued to be governed from Vienna. In the majestic imperial capital, delegates of all nationalities met in a joint parliament, elected after 1907 by universal male suffrage. Meant to inspire cooperation, it was instead a tribute to what disasters the Tower of Babel has wrought on human progress. There was no common language among the deputies and very few translators, so that when an Italian spoke, no one could be sure whether they were listening to the equivalent of Antony's funeral oratory or were being denounced as subhumans. Czech delegates were especially fond of reading out their dinner menus with dramatic gusto. Fortunately for most of the empire's inhabitants, the parliament was little more than a gilded talking shop. Its decisions were of little consequence, and it was regularly closed when the delegates became too intransigent. "My role is to protect my people from their politicians," the emperor once said. Real power remained with him and his civil service, an army of over 3 million bureaucrats that governed the empire, when all was said and done fairly competently. None of them knew how to solve the national question, of course, yet in spite of it there was an odd stability to everything. In the last decades before the war, strong economic growth smoothed over a lot of internal tensions. Few had enough time for infighting when they were busy getting rich. A vast customs union between both Austria and Hungary stimulated trade and technological progress. The Czechs had the great Skoda munition works, rivalled only by Krupp in Germany. The fertile plains of Hungary fed the whole monarchy. New natural resources, like oil, were being discovered in the Polish territories. Stability and success meant that most ethnicities knew which side their bread was buttered. Should the empire collapse, the Czechs, for example, would not gain full independence. They would at best become a Russian client state. At worst, they would be absorbed into Germany with even fewer national rights. If Austria did not exist, she would have to be invented, announced one Czech nationalist. Generally, minority demands were for greater autonomy and power within the monarchy, not outright independence. They nonetheless continued to squabble in Parliament, and outsiders often wondered how such an apparently dysfunctional anachronism could ever survive in the long term. Yet life continued to move forward nonetheless. The situation was always desperate but not serious, quipped one Viennese journalist. Above it all was the Emperor, Franz Joseph. With his immediately recognisable whiskers, deep blue eyes and military dress, he was the embodiment of a rapidly fading 19th century. Franzi, as he was known to his close family, had ascended the throne of the Habsburg monarchy in 1848, at a time when the revolutions of that year were tearing it apart. Through the iron hand of his military, the young emperor had re-established control of his inheritance, but from then on the story had been one of decline. The loss of Italy and Germany had destroyed the empire's preeminent role in European affairs. Internally, his once absolute grip on power now had to make accommodation for parliaments and Hungarian autonomy. Franz Joseph's personal life had mirrored his empire's tragic fate. As a young man, he had married his Bavarian cousin Elizabeth, or Sisi as she was known. Beautiful and lively as a girl, a usually rigid and unromantic Franz Joseph proved an uxorious husband. But Elizabeth unfortunately never grew up. Hating court protocol, she refused to fulfill the duties of an empress or wife, and spent most of her time horse riding or touring Europe instead. In 1898, she was killed by an anarchist whilst in Switzerland. Franz Joseph's only son and heir with her, a clever but troubled boy named Rudolf, had taken his own life nearly a decade earlier in 1889. His brother Maximilian had been executed in Mexico, and his favourite niece had died by accidentally setting herself on fire. "I have been spared nothing in this world," Franz Joseph muttered quietly. Throughout it all, the emperor continued to work, rising just after 4 in the morning and usually remaining at his desk until evening. With determined efficiency, he fulfilled his duties, seeming at times to hold the whole creaking imperial apparatus together by sheer force of will. In Edward Crankshaw's words, "No empire in decline has yet produced a visionary." Franz Joseph was above all an administrator. And in that task, requiring intelligent and incorruptible hard work, he was well suited. Not everyone was content with Franz Joseph's rigid and plodding rule, though. The death of the emperor's only son meant the status of heir apparent passed to a nephew, Franz Ferdinand. Cold, charmless and authoritarian, his only real passion was for massacring wildlife on the hunt. As future head of the most prestigious dynasty in Europe, though, Franz Ferdinand was nonetheless expected to marry well. Instead, in an uncharacteristic fit of passion, he had fallen in love with a lady-in-waiting, Sophie Chotek. The Choteks were still Bohemian nobility, but for a dynasty whose success had been founded on marriage, Franz Joseph was oddly passionate about making sure none were successful. Like anybody, he could hardly derive enjoyment from opening the Eggenberg town hall, but crushing the dreams of the odd pleb still held its medieval appeal. When he finally gave way after intercessions from both the Pope and the German Kaiser, it was on condition that the marriage remained morganatic. Sophie would never be an empress, no children would ever inherit the crown, and, at least to Franz Ferdinand's mind, his uncle from then on appeared to take personal pleasure in slighting her at every possible opportunity. It was not a recipe for a harmonious relationship. Franz Ferdinand spent most of his time at the Grand Belvedere Palace in Vienna, where he set up a sort of shadow court to the actual government. In personality, he was as rigid as his uncle, but several historians have thought his ideas surprisingly open, encouraging a range of different theorists, politicians and writers to offer up their visions of how to reform the Habsburg monarchy. One suggested giving each minority a small territory of their own within the empire, a sort of United States of Austria. Another argued in favour of giving the Slavs in the empire their own kingdom, a la Hungary. Franz Ferdinand himself seems to have eventually settled on a sort of halfway house, revoking the compromise with the Hungarians, whom he despised, and reordering the empire into more of a federated state, including all of the other major nationalities, though he himself would rule most things from Vienna, without a parliament if possible. 25 years of consultations, and the end result was shut up and do what I say. By the 1880s, the Habsburg Empire had settled into its new geopolitical reality. The old order in the Italian peninsula and Germany was gone. Bismarck's icily efficient Prussia stood dominant, leaving only one region open to Austrian influence. The Balkans largely remained under the control of the Ottoman Empire, but if Austria was considered a sick man by some, the Turks appeared to be on life support. Broke, corrupt and ruling over minorities that hated it, nobody expected Constantinople to maintain its hold indefinitely. The concern for Austria was what came next. Much of the peninsula had Orthodox and Slavic populations, naturally more inclined to Russian rather than Catholic and German Habsburg influence. As stated earlier, Bismarck's web of agreements and alliances kept a lid on these tensions between St. Petersburg and Vienna, but they could never be wholly exercised. In 1878, Austria had occupied the Ottoman province of Bosnia-Herzegovina, with the consent of the other European powers. Its mandate was for administrative and economic reform, which it carried out energetically, emancipating peasants, improving productivity and pouring in investment. Opposition was cracked down on ruthlessly, but on the whole the Austrians, like the other European powers in their far-flung colonies, thought of themselves as a force for progress. Quite why the Habsburgs actually needed Bosnia, apart from the usual vague waffle about countering Russian influence, nobody could ever explain. Indeed, all the economic and social advancement in the world could not shake the fact that Austria had absorbed yet another sizable minority, this time a number of new Slavs. Given the chance, a significant portion would have preferred to unite with the small Serbian state across the border. Anyone that paid the slightest bit of attention to their history teacher while staring out of the classroom window will be able to recite something about the Austro-Serb rivalry, which lit the fuse for the Great War. But in the last decades of the 19th century, Serbia was actually an Austrian ally. The Serbian king, Milan, was an avowed Austrophile, to the extent that in 1885 he randomly turned up in Vienna announcing his intention to abdicate and let Austria annex his country. Exasperated Habsburg bureaucrats had bundled him out of the capital, preferring at this point an independent but easily malleable state. Until 1903, this is largely what they got. Milan soon after abdicated anyway, but his son and successor remained firmly inside the Austrian tent. Alexander was a bafflingly erratic man, prone to flit between positions, and had married a much older woman whom the Serbian public thought a grasping social climber. As Balkan and Slavic nationalism grew towards the end of the century, the Serbian military in particular became restless with their king's bizarre governing style and tendency to kowtow to Austria. In 1903, a putsch organised by a group of officers saw husband and wife butchered in the royal palace. Among the conspirators was a young soldier named Dragutin Dmitrievich, known more commonly by his nickname, Apis, a product of the new ultranationalism beginning to grow within the Serbian army. King Alexander's replacement was the Karađorđević dynasty, more liberal in political persuasion, but also willing to take a harder line against Austria. Part of the military in particular hoped they would centre Belgrade's foreign policy around a secret plan drawn up 60 years earlier, known as the Nasa Tanja, a blueprint for sweeping annexations, liberating or conquering all surrounding Serbians. Christopher Clark states that the document was a Magna Carta for Serbian nationalism, influencing the ambitions of its statesmen right up until 1914. This interpretation has more recently been questioned by the likes of John Zemetica, who doubts how much influence it actually had, as contemporary Serbian statesmen talked of it little. Indeed, for nearly a decade following the coup, Serbian foreign policy remained without clear direction. At a foreign policy conference in 1905, Bosnia was at this point only reluctantly brought up as a potential target for expansion because someone suggested it would look bad in the minutes if it wasn't. Whatever the case, the 1903 revolution meant Austria had lost a loyal vassal in the Balkans. To begin with, the Habsburgs viewed the coup as a fait accompli, and recognised the new monarchy with little fuss. Indeed, it was Britain rather than Austria which expressed the most outrage at the regicide, but the Habsburgs quickly grew concerned with their neighbour's new policy, in particular its decision to try and source a large loan for armament expansion from Paris rather than Vienna. Then, in December 1905, it was revealed Serbia had entered into a customs union with Bulgaria, a sure sign that she was trying to escape from her current economic dependence on Austria. The Habsburgs reacted violently, withdrawing from their own talks with Serbia about renewing their existing trade deal and announcing an embargo on pork, Belgrade's main export. The tariff war was to continue for 5 years, but the Serbs refused to concede. Instead, they found new markets throughout the rest of Europe. The small victory meant Belgrade would remain independent, but in the Balkans, independence usually meant pro-Russian. The Austro-Russian rivalry in the Balkans had always been the element most likely to destroy the Second Three Emperors League, as it had the first. Indeed, the revived League of 1881 had been made explicitly to deal with this conflict. The problem was that it realistically could survive as an agreement only so long as there were no conflict. For all Bismarck's mastery of Europe's diplomatic system, he could never solve the Balkan issue, and it frustrated him to no end. After all, what exactly were the Balkans? A group of quarrelling ethnicities of little economic value to either Austria or Russia. But prestige was a must for an empire in the late 19th century. An empire without it would be ignored, and thus neither Vienna or Petersburg could swallow their pride and cut their losses. In 1885, a crisis over the unification of Bulgaria finally put the treaty out of its misery. The end of the League did not necessarily herald a new era of rivalry between Vienna and Petersburg. Indeed, the Balkan question remained relatively static for more than 20 years, but the omens were not good for Austria. Serbia's revolution in 1903 threatened to only be the start of a new order in the Balkans, aimed at sweeping away Austrian influence for good. The end of the Three Emperors League once more posed a serious problem for Bismarck. Reconciling Austria and Russia, at least to the point that they could exist in the same alliance, now seemed impossible. But where did that leave Germany? The Chancellor's solution was typically Bismarckian. He would edge his bets and try to reframe Berlin at the centre of European politics another way. The Triple Alliance with Austria and Italy would be maintained. Russia, though, would receive a new agreement exclusively with Germany, known as the Reinsurance Treaty. Again, it was not a full alliance. The terms only meant that Russia would remain neutral in a French war, and Germany in an Austro-Russian one, where Vienna was the aggressor. But Bismarck was playing a dangerous game now. The Austrian and Russian agreements were bilateral, containing both secret and contradictory promises from Germany to each empire. Indeed, only a select group of people in Berlin and Petersburg even knew of the Reinsurance Treaty's existence. If its terms were ever made public, Bismarck would have been exposed as a cheat to the Austrians, and his entire diplomatic web would come crumbling down. This is not to say Germany had lost its European influence, but the diplomatic dance Bismarck had to partake in to maintain it, master ballerina that he was, seemed to be getting more complex by the month. It was a situation about to be made worse by domestic forces. In 1888, Bismarck had governed Prussia and then Germany for more than a quarter of a century. He could only do so because of the constant loyalty and commitment shown to him by Kaiser Wilhelm I. The old monarch still balked at many of Bismarck's policies, questioned his convoluted agreements and treaties that seemed to have little respect for honour or chivalry. But he knew he was dependent on his chancellor and generally allowed him free rein. That year though, at the astonishing age of 90, Wilhelm finally died. His son and heir was 58-year-old Crown Prince Frederick. In stark contrast to his conservative and autocratic father, Frederick was an outspoken liberal. As a young man, he had married Victoria, or Vicky as she was more commonly known, the Princess Royal of England. "Oh madame, it is a princess," announced the physician to Queen Victoria upon delivering her. "Never mind, the next will be a prince," replied the indefatigable queen. Nonetheless, Vicky proved to be her parents' favourite. Intelligent, articulate, but strong and willful, her father, the prince consort in particular, held Vicky in high regard. "You are quite your dear, beloved papa's child," the queen wrote to her daughter. "You are so learned and so fond of deep philosophical books that you are quite beyond me." Victoria and Albert had a total of 9 children, and all of them had a specific future planned. The royal couple's hope was to use their marriages to promote European peace, progress and liberalism. Key to this plan was Vicky. Albert had come from a small German principality, whilst Victoria also descended from the House of Hanover, and viewed herself in the first years of her marriage as being more German than English. Their greatest desire was to see a liberal and unified Germany, partnered with Great Britain, leading Europe into a new age. Vicky was to make this dream a reality. In 1851 she had been introduced to the handsome Prince Frederick of Prussia at the Great Exhibition held in London that year. He was 20, she was just 10, and immediately smitten. 4 years later at Balmoral, the Queen's retreat in the Scottish Highlands, the Prince proposed. The marriage was delayed until Vicky was 17, and in the meantime caused friction between the British and Prussian courts. The latter stated it was traditional for Prussian princes to be married in Berlin. Queen Victoria demanded her Foreign Secretary refuse. Whatever may be the usual practice of Prussian princes, it is not every day that one marries the eldest daughter of the Queen of England. The question must therefore be considered settled and closed. Both sides refused to budge. On the 25th of January 1858, the marriage of Frederick and Vicky finally took place, in St James's Chapel, London. Albert and Victoria hoped their daughter would mould the Prussian prince, then the kingdom, then Germany, into good liberals. On one account at least they were successful. Fritz, as he was known, was always liberal inclined anyway, and admired the Westminster parliamentary system. But Vicky gave form to his ideas. When he was presented with memoranda, his usual response was, "We shall have to see what the Crown Princess thinks." Yet Fritz remained a thorough Prussian in many other respects, much to Vicky's disapproval. When his father threatened to abdicate during the 1862 crisis with the Landtag, something that would have given Frederick the crown, it was he that talked the king back, on the basis that abdication would dishonour the monarchy. And when it came time for Bismarck to unify Germany with iron and blood, rather than the liberalism and progress envisaged by Prince Albert, Fritz fought gallantly in all 3 of the wars, earning the Iron Cross for his bravery. That wasn't good enough for Bismarck though, who distrusted his liberalism and Vicky's continued love of her home country. They were consequently excluded from government, unable to even see state papers, and left effectively out in the cold for more than 25 long years. When the old Kaiser finally died in 1888, more than a quarter of a century after Vicky had first arrived in Berlin, hoping to inject the liberalism of that era into it, she was too late. A year earlier, Fritz, always a heavy smoker, had been diagnosed with throat cancer. Seriously ill by the time he inherited, his reign lasted just 99 days. Frederick is often considered one of the great what-ifs in 19th century history, though it's worth noting the liberals that had once dominated the Landtag had long since been broken by Bismarck. What realistically Fritz and Vicky could have achieved in the face of opposition from the army, aristocracy and Iron Chancellor is unclear. Whatever the case, it's a counterfactual that has caught the imagination of many, if only for the fact that what came next was so different. The third emperor of 1888 was Vicky and Fritz's eldest son, now styled Wilhelm II. Just 29 years old, yet already immediately recognisable with his handsome face, constant posing and pointed moustache, which his barber stuck up with wax every morning. Photos usually show him in some way attempting to hide his arm, which suffered from a deformity caused by a traumatic birth. The disability made his left hand practically useless, and deeply distressed Vicky, who'd wanted to raise the perfect Prussian prince. To correct it, the young Wilhelm was given everything from electrical shock therapy to having a freshly slaughtered hare strapped on. Nothing worked, and as a boy he felt suffocated by his mother's rigorous educational regime, meant to mould him into a type of English liberal that was by then dying out even in England. Feeling starved of affection by his mother, but also determined to rebel against her ideas, Wilhelm instead found himself attracted to the traditional conservative and militarist values of Prussia. When he was posted to an elite guards regiment as a young man, he announced he had finally found his home. Bismarck watched all of this with pleasure. He did not expect Wilhelm to take the throne in his lifetime, but a conservative son could be useful for when the Chancellor inevitably had to deal with the liberal father. To this end, he arranged for Wilhelm to gain some experience in the Foreign Office, even allowing him to read confidential state documents, a privilege that had never been afforded to Fritz. Determined to marry young and provide heirs for the dynasty, Wilhelm first fell in love with his cousin Elizabeth of Hesse-Darmstadt, but Ella, as she was known, rejected him, finding Wilhelm bombastic, conceited and overbearing. On the rebound, he instead married Augusta Victoria, or Donna for short. The marriage was to be a relatively happy one. Donna was dull and plain, but gave Wilhelm the attention he desperately craved, and eventually bore him 8 healthy children. She was also extremely conservative, deeply Anglophobic, and loathed liberalism, further separating Wilhelm from his parents. When it was clear Frederick was dying, Wilhelm reacted with a mixture of genuine sadness and barely disguised anticipation. On the 15th of June, he became emperor of the most powerful country in Europe. His first Crown Council was captured in this portrait. Note in it the intriguing position of the characters. The new Kaiser is elevated, confident and striking in body language, and just beneath him, Bismarck, looking old and worn out. The painting illustrates the conflict that was to divide Germany for the next 2 years. Bismarck had been used to going about his business unchallenged. Now he had to contend with a bumptious new monarch, determined to rule as well as reign. From the beginning, Wilhelm made it clear his intention would be to eventually break with Bismarck, once he had learned the ropes of government. He disliked the Chancellor's almost dictatorial control over Germany, especially as by this point Bismarck ruled mainly from his country estate miles outside of Berlin, too far for Wilhelm to easily question him. With Bismarck as Chancellor, how could the Kaiser ever exercise his own will for Germany? Bismarck had brought much of this on himself. It was he that had encouraged Wilhelm to associate with those reactionary sections of the Prussian elite who now urged the Kaiser to seize power. It was he that had inflated Wilhelm's self-confidence whilst he was still a prince, in the expectation of using him as a counterweight to his father. He had never expected to deal with him as emperor. The focus of Wilhelm's complaints quickly became foreign policy. Bismarck's role of honest broker had made him personally very important in the European system, settling the territorial squabbles of other powers, encouraging other empires' expansionary policies overseas, trying at all costs to preserve the peace of Europe. But what exactly did this do for Germany? Why should Berlin always play the disinterested benevolent, whilst other states carved up the map? Bismarck had, of course, reluctantly picked up a few measly colonies in the face of public demand, but as Britain and France gobbled up the rest of Africa, Russia expanded in Asia and Austria in the Balkans, Germany's territorial ambitions seemed distinctly lacking. Bismarck's response was that Germany was a satiated power, her borders were relatively defensible, and in time the immense economic potential of the Reich would increase her strength organically. Getting involved in territorial squabbles, and consequently risking war, was the only real way this could be upset. For Wilhelm, though, such pacifism would not do. Germany by 1890 had the most powerful economy on the continent. It had overtaken even Britain in several traditional industries, though with the caveat that on a GDP per capita basis its population still lagged behind considerably. Even so, Germany seemed primed to dominate Europe, seize its own colonial empire and become the world's foremost power, at least to the more radical parts of the Prussian military. Bismarckian edging would no longer do. The power struggle between the Kaiser and Bismarck and the Chancellor's ultimate dismissal in 1890 is often cited as compelling evidence for Wilhelm's incompetence to govern. Yet in truth, it was Bismarck that seemed to be losing his political Midas touch. The Constitution of Germany meant that whilst the Chancellor could only be appointed and dismissed by the Kaiser, in practice he had to work with the national parliament, the Reichstag, to pass any laws. Bismarck held no party allegiance and relied on making ad hoc coalitions between the various political factions. By 1888, this strategy was wearing thin. When anti-socialist laws came up for renewal, the Chancellor insisted they be extended, giving the police extensive powers to remove agitators from their own homes. The mix of conservatives and liberals that made up Bismarck's Reichstag coalition was split over implementing such autocratic measures. In the midst of this, Wilhelm intervened, supporting a suggestion to renew the laws without the clause allowing home expulsions. Bismarck would have none of it. Instead, he openly tried to subvert the Kaiser by getting the entire set of laws vetoed. When confronted, he announced his true aim was precipitating a crisis with the socialists, which he could then use as an excuse to crush them with the army. This was as close to insanity as Bismarck ever came, and Wilhelm understandably did not want to start his reign with a civil war. The farce meant Bismarck's majority in the Reichstag collapsed, and the Chancellor was unable to form another. "I have come from the political deathbed of a great man," said a former rival after a meeting with Bismarck in which he was invited to join a new coalition. And so he had. Everyone knew it was the end. Bismarck wrote Wilhelm a scathing resignation letter, which the Kaiser quietly accepted. The public was told the founder of the German Empire had retired due to ill health. His thanks was the title Duke of Lauenburg, useful only for when I want to travel incognito, Bismarck quipped. The Iron Chancellor retired to his estates, vengefully bitter towards Wilhelm. Jena came 20 years after the death of Frederick the Great. The crash will come 20 years after my departure, if things go on like this. He died in 1898. 20 years later, Wilhelm fled across the Dutch border into exile as the German Empire collapsed around him. The Kaiser now had full control over German policy, and he intended to use it, embarking upon what became known as the New Course. His replacement for the Iron Chancellor was Leopold von Caprivi, at 59 the model of a competent, efficient and stoic Prussian officer. Devoted to his work, he would normally have been a good choice. But Caprivi had been given a near impossible task. Both the German constitution and the country's place in the European system had been engineered to revolve almost entirely around Bismarck. With his sudden dismissal, Caprivi was left to pick up the pieces, whilst Wilhelm bounced from one idea to another. "I know I shall be covered with mud, and that I shall fall ingloriously," the new Chancellor muttered. The most pressing issue facing Germany in 1890 was whether to renew the reinsurance treaty with Russia. Until his appointment, Caprivi, like almost everybody else, had no knowledge of the secret pact which altered entirely Germany's geopolitical position. Within a week of taking office, he had to decide if it should be continued. For his part, the Kaiser had already confused matters by giving a delighted Russian ambassador his personal guarantee of the treaty's renewal. But Caprivi, with very little understanding of foreign affairs, was instead convinced by a key official in the Foreign Office, Friedrich von Holstein, to let the agreement lapse. The reinsurance treaty, so Holstein argued, needlessly complicated relations with Austria, who didn't know of its existence and might cancel their own alliance with Germany if they ever found out. Besides, alliance with Russia was also blocking better relations with Britain, whom St. Petersburg was in competition with in Central Asia. Persuaded, Caprivi decided against renewal in favour of a simple and transparent foreign policy. The Russians, not least the ambassador who had been given Wilhelm's personal promise of the treaty's renewal, were dumbfounded. They were now without an alliance, staring at a potentially hostile bloc of Germany, Austria and Italy right next door to them. It was a strategic catastrophe that they had to escape. But there was only one obvious way to do so. On the 23rd of July, only a year after Germany's refusal to renew the reinsurance treaty, a French naval flotilla paid a visit to the Russian naval base of Kronstadt, and the Tsar gave a reception for its commander. The lack of coordination between Wilhelm and his Chancellor over the reinsurance treaty was not an aberration. During his 4.5 years in power, Caprivi offered or threatened to resign 10 times. Wearied by having to deal with the Kaiser's schizophrenic policies. One day, an army captain randomly appeared at Caprivi's office and announced he was the newly appointed governor of German Cameroon. Caprivi assumed the man was deranged and tried to send him away, but it became apparent that Wilhelm had in fact given him the job off the cuff after meeting him at a reception. The Kaiser gave way on the appointment when questioned, but these constant occurrences tired Caprivi. In October 1894, his resignation was finally accepted. "The Kaiser is like a balloon," Bismarck had once said of Wilhelm. "If you don't keep fast hold of the string, you never know where he will be off to." Having got a taste for power, Wilhelm desired a chancellor that would now merely be a vessel for his concept of personal rule, allowing him to govern Germany as he saw fit. "I shall take a younger man," the Kaiser declared. On the 29th of October, he appointed Prince Hohenlohe, aged 75. An old and experienced statesman, by this point he was physically decrepit and did his best to avoid the job, knowing he didn't have the strength or stamina for it. This suited Wilhelm, who thought a barely sentient coffin dodger would be less inclined to block his meddling. Hohenlohe, like a tarrying grandfather, tried to moderate the Kaiser's tendencies, but to no avail. By 1897 he'd effectively given up. Almost 80 years old, tired, ill, totally indolent, and completely passive, was his successor's assessment. The unrestrained freedom brought out the worst in Wilhelm. Whilst the German machinery of government was always efficient and largely able to carry out the daily tasks of running the country seamlessly, the ship was effectively rudderless, as the Kaiser bounced from one idea to another, suggesting a grandiose scheme at breakfast only to drop it by dinner. Wilhelm had his grip on Germany, but Germany's grip on European politics was rapidly slipping away. In 1900, the eyes of the world turned to Paris, as it hosted the greatest display of European wealth for 50 years. The Exposition Universelle showed off a century of technological, scientific and social progress. Elaborate pavilions were set up by over 40 nations, announcing their innovations and culture to a staggering attendance of nearly 50 million people. The Canadians presented onlookers with piles of furs. The Portuguese decorated their pavilion with ornamental fish. The Swiss constructed theirs in the style of a quaint chalet. Germany's stall, tactfully considering the location, did not dwell on its military victories, instead recreating Frederick the Great's library. Though the exhibition included countries from around the globe, no one doubted that for the Western world, it was a celebration of their power and wealth. But for France, it was also an opportunity. Unlike her guests, Marianne had no single pavilion of her own. The whole exhibition was a monument to French civilization. Under the gaze of the new Eiffel Tower, built just over 10 years earlier, room after room of special exhibits were devoted to French achievement. To all outsiders it was a triumph, but one couldn't quite shake the feeling that for France it was compensating. 30 years before, the country had been left broken and defeated by the victorious Prussian army. Louis XIV's majestic Hall of Mirrors, once an outlandish representation of his kingdom's wealth and power, now played host to the ceremony that proclaimed a new German empire. The change in France's international position cannot be overstated. For centuries the country had been the preeminent force on the European continent, used to dealing with a Germany that was divided and weak, a playground for French armies and influence. Now it faced a united empire with a larger economy, military and population. Nonetheless, the French resolved to overcome their humiliation. In just 3 years, the enormous 5 billion franc indemnity was paid off. The army was put through a revolutionary series of reforms. Universal free education introduced throughout the country. Schoolboys were to be taught of the lost provinces and their coming return to France from the start. Everything pointed to a unity of purpose, everything except the government. In the aftermath of the war, France had become a republic, but nobody expected it to last. A republic meant factionalism, and factionalism meant infighting whilst the Prussian wolf was at the door. In the 1871 elections, the monarchists won a majority. The exiled Bourbon pretender, Henri, was invited to take his crown, but Henri refused. He would not accept the revolutionary tricolour as the national flag. The French people would not accept him without it. His ancestor had declared Paris was worth a mass, worth a rag though it was apparently not. Thus the Republic endured, the system which divides us the least, the first president Thiers said, an island of meritocracy in a sea of monarchies. The isolation was exaggerated by Bismarck's machinations, keeping out of reach either an Austrian or Russian partnership. Italy squabbled with France over African territories like Tunisia. Only Britain was friendly throughout the 1870s, though she would never have considered a formal alliance. Then, in 1881, the British had occupied Egypt. Egypt had always been within France's sphere of influence, at least as far as Paris was concerned. Only a few years before, it had been a French engineer and French finance that built the Suez Canal, the great waterway that finally connected the Mediterranean and Red Seas. The insult was too much, and Britain was now added to the growing list of nations under Marianne's curse. National isolation meant there was no possibility of revising the settlement of 1871, but the loss of Alsace-Lorraine could never be forgotten. In Paris, the statue representing Strasbourg, capital of Alsace, was draped in black. Student textbooks described the Treaty of Frankfurt as a truce, not a peace. Nationalist politicians clamoured for revenge. On the whole, though, the French understood that, for now at least, the territory was lost. And after the 1870s, much of the initial nationalist fervour, if never extinguished, at least settled down. Neither war nor renunciation, the future socialist leader Jean Jaurès announced. France instead looked to recoup prestige abroad, particularly by expanding its colonial empire in Africa and the Far East. Foreign investment in new markets like the Ottoman Empire began to flow, and, like with Alsace, she did not give up on the hope of snatching Egypt back from the British. All of these moves were encouraged by Bismarck, watching eagle-eyed from Berlin, and hoping to direct French energies elsewhere. It generally worked. For nearly 2 decades, Paris sought to expand overseas. At times, its quarrels with Germany almost seemed to have been forgotten. But the old tensions could never truly be settled. In the late 1880s, they suddenly came close to boiling point with the emergence of General Boulanger. Handsome and popular, he campaigned on a platform of 3 R's: revanche, revision and restoration. The phrase gained nationwide support and several Bollywood awards. All of Europe braced for a new Napoleon, determined to redress France's place in the world with military force. But Boulanger was no Napoleon. Indeed, he was more idea than man, capable of rousing a people, but not of leading them. Just when an overthrow of the Republic seemed inevitable, the general lost his nerve and fled to Belgium. A few months later, he shot himself. Boulangerism as a movement disappeared almost in a puff of smoke, but the ideas it represented, dissatisfaction with the Republic, extreme nationalism, and most of all revanche, the desire for revenge against Germany, could never be exercised. Still, what could France do? At the beginning of 1890, Bismarck remained in power. Neither Russia nor Austria would countenance breaking with Germany. France, it seemed, was destined to remain isolated and spurned. In Dominic Lieben's words, as empires go, the Russian Empire was a success. From a tiny principality centred on Moscow in the 14th century, it had expanded to encompass 1/6 of the Earth's landmass. Its resistance to Napoleon in 1812 had won the country enormous prestige, and a permanent seat at the European table of great powers. With its enormous population, even Bismarck feared a confrontation that would pit Germany against never-ending legions of hardy Slavic peasants. In 1890, the Russian Empire was governed by Alexander III. Unlike his monarchical peers in Austria and Germany, who had to make accommodations with parliaments and a relatively free press, the Tsars had no such limitations. Orthodoxy, autocracy and nationality was the motto that Alexander subscribed to. With his bald head, bear-like features and enormous size both in height and girth, the Tsar seemed to personally embody the formidable and self-reliant Russia he idealised. When the Austrian ambassador, vexed by some dispute, suggested to Alexander at a dinner party that his country might mobilise a corps on the Russian border, the Tsar calmly picked up a fork, twisted it into a knot and plonked it down in front of the ambassador. "That is what I will do to your army corps." Despite his aggressive instincts, however, Alexander's reign was a remarkably peaceful one in Russian history. Part of this was down to domestic limitations. The Tsar had inherited the throne in 1881, after the assassination of his father by socialist revolutionaries. These movements, secret societies largely made up of intellectuals and students, were more prominent in Russia than anywhere else in Europe, and the first part of Alexander's reign was spent suppressing them. Among those hanged for plotting against the Tsar was Alexander Ulyanov. His death was to be a formative influence in the career of his younger brother, Vladimir. The main reason for Russia's cautious policy in this era, though, was the foreign minister, Nikolai Gyr. Calm, realistic and deeply conservative, he felt Russia's peculiar social order depended upon peace. The Turkish War of 1878, though allegedly a victory, had driven the empire close to bankruptcy. A defeat could bring down the whole regime, and Gyr was under no illusion that defeat would be the result of any conflict with a Western power. The Crimean War of the 1850s had pitted Russia's never-ending manpower against the smaller, modern industrial armies of Britain and France, and the British and French had won. Russia might have been flourishing culturally, but economically it remained a backwater, in per capita terms its wealth ranking beside Spain. And so, Alexander repressed his natural inclinations and remained cautious internationally. On a personal level, for example, he disliked Germans. His pretty Danish wife Dagmar hated the accursed Prussians for stealing her father's duchies in the Schleswig War, and the Tsar felt Bismarck had betrayed Russia by stiffing her at the Berlin Conference. But knowing Russia needed German friendship, he kept to the Three Emperors League, and when it fell apart, agreed to the reinsurance treaty with Berlin. He expected this secret pact, which guaranteed German neutrality should Austria attack Russia, to be maintained when it came up for renewal in 1890. Instead, Bismarck's fall and Wilhelm II's refusal to renew the agreement blindsided Alexander's government. St. Petersburg was now staring at an Austro-German alliance right on its doorstep, with no other friend to assist. The solution was obviously then to find one. Almost immediately talks began with France. On the 23rd of July 1891, a French naval squadron visited the Russian port of Kronstadt, just outside of St. Petersburg. There they were greeted by Tsar Alexander himself, who even stood to attention for the Marseillaise, until then banned in Russia due to its republicanism. Gyr and the French foreign minister agreed informally that in case of war the two nations would offer a joint response. More detailed arrangements were made the next year, including a mutual defence pact against Germany. By 1894, the alliance had been formalised. To Paris, this was practically manna from heaven. For nearly 20 years she had been shut out from the European diplomatic system by Bismarck. Now France again had power on the continental stage. Not everyone in Russia, though, met the French alliance with equanimity. France, after all, was the most radical regime in Europe. What would associating with it do to the Tsarist system in the long run? Even on a strategic level there were doubts. What exactly could France offer Russia? In any war, Germany would have to maintain a sizable army on the French border, whether Paris was actually part of the conflict or not. And if war were to break out, it was surely more likely to be over Alsace-Lorraine, in which case Russia would be fighting for a territory it had no interest in on the other side of the continent. But these concerns were reluctantly dismissed. At least in the short term, both Alexander and Gyr agreed the French alliance would be essential to Russian security. By the turn of the century then, the European alliance systems were firmly cemented in place. Germany, Austria and Italy made up the Triple Alliance. Russia and France formed the Double Entente. Theoretically, this formalised the balance of power on the continent. The great powers were now divided into roughly equal camps. No one state could bully another. The diplomatic map of Europe was much clearer than it had been when governed by Bismarck's secretive and contradictory promises. Indeed, for the next 20 years, the alliances were celebrated as guarantors of peace rather than possible causes of war. In the complex and muddled world of international relations, they brought clarity. The problem with them, though, was that such arrangements were aberrations in 19th century Europe. Previous ententes had been of an ad hoc and limited nature. France and Britain in the Crimean War, Austria and Russia in the revolutions of 1848. This allowed the European powers much more fluidity on the international stage. It also meant that if there was a war, such as those that Bismarck engineered in the 1860s, they would be small and avoid engulfing the whole continent. Now, one spark was all that it would take to set Europe ablaze. It was a new era, placing 4 of the 5 great powers into opposing camps. Yet a map tells us that the old world was not wholly undone quite yet. One power remained conspicuously absent of any entanglement, ensconced across the water in a fortress built by nature, for the moment untouched by Europe's quarrels. On the 22nd of June 1897, London, imperial capital of the world and heart of the British Empire, was brought to a standstill as Victoria, Queen of the United Kingdom, Empress of India, Defender of the Faith, and the then longest reigning monarch in British history, celebrated her Diamond Jubilee. Soldiers from an imperium that encompassed nearly a quarter of the globe, including India, Africa, Australia, Canada, South Africa, and Malaysia, took part in the military parades. At Spithead, the Prince of Wales reviewed the largest naval fleet in the world, rows and rows of warships lined up as far as the eye could see. Empire. Empire was the word of the day. Unlike the celebrations for the Queen's Golden Jubilee a decade earlier, involving large contingents from all European nations, 1897 was to be an imperial holiday. The Colonial Secretary, Joseph Chamberlain, in particular intended the festivities to double as a display of British power to the world. And the world was impressed. The French newspaper Le Figaro announced that Rome itself had been surpassed. The New York Times crowed that America was a part, and a great part, of the Greater Britain which seemed so plainly destined to dominate the planet. Even the Kreuz Zeitung in Berlin, mouthpiece for hostile Junkers, described the empire as practically unassailable. Only a few voices crying in the wilderness offered tenuous doubts. "Far called our navies melt away," Rudyard Kipling wrote in a poem composed for the Jubilee. "Lo, all our pomp of yesterday is one with Nineveh and Tyre." In 1897 though, a challenge to British power seemed almost unthinkable. The 19th century had been Britain's century. Following Napoleon's defeat, her empire had expanded rapidly. Her economy had surpassed all others. Her navy dwarfed its competitors. The notion that Britain had been given a divinely ordained mission to make the world English was a commonly held one. Her civilization, so many thought, had proved itself manifestly superior to all others. Yet nagging doubts remained. That year, the Prime Minister was the 3rd Marquess of Salisbury. Tall, fat and rich, superficially he looked every bit the self-assured British aristocrat, confident of his place within an order that had endured for centuries. In fact, Salisbury was shy, neurotic and depressive. He was also fiercely intelligent and had the best grasp of foreign policy of any premier in history. But these factors all combined to make him deeply pessimistic about the future of the empire and European civilization. Whatever happens will be for the worse, and therefore it is in our interest that as little should happen as possible, was his motto. Like Kipling, Salisbury was wary that the only direction for a nation at the top was down. 2 years later, the empire was at war. In South Africa, the British-owned Cape Colony existed uneasily alongside 2 Boer republics, inhabited by the descendants of earlier Dutch settlers. Although the Transvaal had beaten the British in a small clash 2 decades earlier, the twin impoverished states had seemed destined to remain within the much richer Cape Colony's orbit anyway. But the discovery of huge gold deposits in the late 1880s had breathed new life into them. This windfall funded the ambitions of the Transvaal's President Kruger, allowing him to dream of breaking free from British influence, perhaps even establishing Boer supremacy throughout the whole of South Africa. Gold, however, brought new challenges as well. Thousands of prospectors had been drawn in by the lure of fortune, a large percentage of them British. They were onerously taxed to fund Kruger's schemes and afforded few political rights. Many of these Uitlanders, as they were known by the Boers, petitioned the British government for aid. The Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, a ruthless diamond magnate and devoted British imperialist named Cecil Rhodes, sensed an opportunity. He calculated that if the Uitlanders could be persuaded to revolt, the Boer republics would be overthrown from the inside, and British rule established throughout the whole of South Africa. In 1895, he arranged for his colleague Leander Jameson to stage a raid into the Transvaal with the aim of stirring up such a rising. The operation was an unmitigated disaster. The Uitlanders failed to rise and Jameson was quickly captured. Throughout Europe there was outrage at what looked like an unprovoked invasion of Boer territory. It's questionable how much the British government actually knew about the plan. The Colonial Secretary, Joseph Chamberlain, probably had some idea, though he denied it vigorously. With his handsome face, white orchid and distinctive monocle, Joe, as he was fondly known nationwide, was made for the media age. Unlike many of his Unionist peers, he was a self-made man, earning his fortune in the screw-making business. Having served as mayor of Birmingham, a region he politically dominated for the rest of his life, Chamberlain originally entered politics as a radical committed to social reform, and was widely expected to lead the Liberal Party at some point. Throughout the 1880s though, he had taken an interest in imperial affairs. When the Liberals began to advocate for Irish Home Rule, the policy of giving Ireland a devolved administration, Chamberlain split from them, believing it would divide the empire disastrously. This faction of renegade Liberals, known as Liberal Unionists, supported Salisbury's Tory administration between 1886 and 1892. When Salisbury returned to power in 1895, he included Unionists in his cabinet. Chamberlain was offered any of the great offices of state. He chose instead to become Colonial Secretary. There he put imperial matters front and centre of the government's agenda. Until then, the empire had often been an afterthought to both the British government and public. Its expansion, though rapid, was generally haphazard and ad hoc. British settler colonies, known as the Dominions, were if anything regarded as a nuisance, and London seemed hasty to devolve as much power to them as possible. This received wisdom was something Chamberlain had initially embraced. In the 1880s though, he had read a book that changed his thinking entirely. Sir John Robert Seeley's The Expansion of England, released in 1883, posited that if London continued to ignore the settler colonies such as the Cape, they would eventually drift away and Britain would be left a third-class nation. Instead, Seeley argued, Britain should embrace these outposts of Englishness as part of the country, going so far as to unite with them in some sort of federal state if possible. Only then would Britain be assured of continued preeminence in the international order. It was an analysis Chamberlain embraced wholesale, and in this context his willingness to confront the Boers, the last real colonial threat to the empire, makes sense. In 1897, Chamberlain selected Alfred Milner, an up-and-coming civil servant that had made a name for himself in Egypt, as the new governor for the Cape. Milner did not intend to let the Boers get in the way of his mission, a key part of which was bringing the Transvaal to heel. His main point of frustration was that Kruger consistently upped the residency qualification for Uitlanders to gain the franchise, from 1 year to 5 and eventually 14 on vague pretexts. But the crux of the argument was that Uitlanders with the vote would almost certainly kick Kruger out of office. In early June 1899, Milner and Kruger met in person at Bloemfontein, capital of the Orange Free State. Milner demanded a franchise based on a retroactive 5-year qualification, which would have given most Uitlanders the vote. But the most Kruger would offer was an elaborately guarded 7-year qualification. A furious Milner walked out and tensions snapped. The British began sending reinforcements down to the Cape, the Boers responded with an ultimatum. The British refused, the Boers invaded. Although the Boers initially outnumbered their enemy and quickly laid siege to the 3 fortified towns of Kimberley, Ladysmith and Mafeking, everyone in London expected a swift victory once relief forces were dispatched. But the Boers were all experienced horse and riflemen, and badly led British attacks were easily beaten back. That December they suffered a string of defeats in quick succession in an event dubbed Black Week. Instead of 3 months, the war was to take 3 years, 450,000 soldiers, and £210 million. "We've received no end of a lesson," wrote Kipling. Although the British had actually fought a highly successful military campaign once the more incompetent generals were replaced with Field Marshal Roberts and Lord Kitchener, there can be no denying the initial defeats came as a terrible shock to everyone in Britain. If the empire floundered against two small republics, how could it be expected to stand against a great European power? The problem was compounded by Britain's lack of allies. Whereas France's isolation on the international stage had been involuntary, for the British it was intentional. The policy was dubbed splendid isolation, though the strategy's greatest practitioner, Salisbury, disliked the term. Salisbury, who served as Foreign Secretary as well as Prime Minister, did not believe in isolation per se. He was happy to work with other nations towards specific and limited goals, settling a border dispute here, agreeing to cooperate there. But he absolutely refused to be drawn into any sort of formal alliance. Such a commitment, he reasoned, could drag Britain into a war she did not want to fight. The Boer War did not shake Salisbury's belief in this strategy, but Salisbury was old. In 1899 his wife had died, and the next year he retired first from the Foreign Office, then finally as Prime Minister at the end of the conflict in 1902. He died a year later. The steady retirement of the great Marquess opened opportunities for a new direction in British foreign policy, and Chamberlain was keen to seize them. The Boer War had convinced the Colonial Secretary that Britain needed allies. Throughout the conflict, an outpouring of Anglophobia in foreign newspapers had been too loud for him to ignore. There were even rumblings of French and Russian attempts to form a continental league aimed at intervening on the side of the Boers. These plans had come to naught, partly because of Austria and Germany. "In this war I am completely English," the Emperor Franz Joseph loudly declared to the British ambassador, within earshot of his French counterpart, whilst the Kaiser, despite previously expressing pro-Boer sympathies, now batted away any notion of challenging Britain in the war. It was then to Germany that Chamberlain looked. Thrice the Colonial Secretary tried to reach out for some sort of agreement. Thrice he was rebuffed. Although Wilhelm wavered between excitement and uncertainty, the new Chancellor, von Bulow, preferred to wait. He distrusted the British parliamentary system and felt that if he delayed, London's position would only grow weaker, allowing him to negotiate better terms. But Chamberlain was not a man to be spurned lightly. Ever the businessman, he decided that if Germany would not buy his goods, he intended to take them elsewhere. In this he was supported by the new Foreign Secretary, Lord Lansdowne. The country they finally decided upon, though, was not European at all. Japan had only opened its borders to the world 50 years earlier, but since then had been put through a rapid series of modernising reforms. By the turn of the century, it was a growing and ambitious power in the Far East. Salisbury, still Prime Minister at this point, opposed any alliance when it was first suggested, as always fearing it would bind Britain's hands. But he was overruled by the cabinet. Alliance with Japan would allow part of the overstretched Royal Navy to be redeployed from the Far East, let Britain counter Russian influence in the region, and do so whilst committing themselves to very little via the favourable terms of the treaty. Decades of British policy had been overturned, and the reasoning for doing so was about to become all the clearer. By the turn of the century, Wilhelm II had been on the throne for 12 years, but in his mind accomplished little. Economically, Germany was growing at a tremendous pace, the army remained the most feared in Europe, and Berlin was quickly rivaling Vienna and Paris as cultural capital of the continent. The Kaiser had even initially sponsored a range of long overdue reforms, such as a fairer rationalisation of the Prussian tax system. Yet compared to some of those first lofty goals that he had imagined upon his accession, a great colonial empire, a Germany capable of world power, perhaps even continental hegemony, other achievements seemed frustratingly little. For the most part though, Wilhelm did not have the patience for the complex and slow-moving diplomatic game these objectives would have required. Instead, he occasionally amused himself with sporadic interventions. When he heard of the Jameson raid's failure in 1895, the Kaiser sent a telegram of congratulations to President Kruger, offering him future German assistance and outraging Britain. He made headlines by announcing to a battalion of his troops going to fight the Boxer Rebellion in China that they should behave like Huns, a nickname for German soldiers that stuck. And he would prattle on about Europe's need to combat the yellow peril of Asia to whoever would listen. But none of these antics could hide his dissatisfaction with Germany's current trajectory. Who was the Kaiser, now 40 years old and in the prime of his life? Unlike his father, Wilhelm did undoubtedly have the capacity for some sort of greatness. He was intelligent, energetic, and genuinely desired love and respect from his subjects. But he was also insecure, erratic, and often appeared to verge on the insane. The Constitution of Germany gave him immense executive power as sovereign, but he lacked the concentration needed to wield it effectively. Instead, he tended to dip in and out of departments as he saw fit, usually bypassing altogether responsible ministers to pursue policies either different or diametrically opposed to the government's official position. He matched this with plans that ranged from the grandiose to bizarre, a new Germany in Brazil to be flooded with German immigrants as soon as possible, a colony in Mesopotamia, a partition of China with the other great powers. Sort of like a small child or a Labrador, Wilhelm would set his sights on something, briefly pursue it with relentless vigour, then give up when any resistance was encountered. His gaffes have of course become the stuff of legend. The Reich has one leader and I am he declared to a group of Rhinish industrialists in 1891. The comment was meant to be a jab at the recently sacked Bismarck, but instead ended up offending the various non-Prussian German kings and princes. He infuriated the ruler of Bulgaria, Ferdinand, by slapping him on the bottom at one function. At another, he cornered the new King Albert of Belgium and demanded to know what he would do in a European war. The most famous aspect of Wilhelm's character has inevitably been his militarism. His constant wearing of military uniforms and regular talk of war has made for an ample villain figure. Yet the reality was a man whose views verged on pacifist whenever things genuinely threatened to ending conflict. Right up until the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, Wilhelm spent every crisis talking a big game, but always found reasons to draw back when things escalated. In 1914, it was only because the Austrians refused to give him the opportunity this did not happen once more. As Churchill put it, he wanted Napoleon's conquests without fighting Napoleon's battles. Potentially great, but weak. Salisbury perhaps summed up his role in the European system best when he said, "It is a nuisance that one of the main factors in the European calculation should be so ultra-human." Maybe the most intolerable thing about Germany's continued lack of power, Wilhelm thought, was the way he was treated in England. The first grandchild of Queen Victoria, Wilhelm's links with Britain were stronger than any other European monarch. But as with all extended families, Wilhelm could never quite decide if he actually liked them or not. He adored his grandmother, he enjoyed the leisurely British way of life whenever he visited. Yet Englishmen were a strange breed. They were not rude or unpleasant, just a bit patronising, an ingrained sense of superiority over even a king of Prussia. The worst offender, Wilhelm decided, was his uncle Bertie, the Prince of Wales. Fat, jovial and relaxed, he was the embodiment of British self-satisfaction. What irked the Kaiser was his uncle's habit of treating all of his many relatives the same, but Wilhelm was an emperor, not some random duke of a town with an unpronounceable name. The Kaiser felt he knew the reason why. "I had a peculiar passion for the navy," Wilhelm wrote years later in his memoirs. "It sprang to no small extent from my English blood. As a child, Wilhelm had frequented Osborne House, his grandmother's seaside retreat on the Isle of Wight. 5 miles away across the Solent was the Royal Navy's base at Portsmouth. There he could gaze upon the warships that had won England an empire. I admired the proud English ships in those 2 superb harbours. Then there awoke in me the wish to build ships of my own like these someday, and when I was grown up to possess as fine a navy as the English." In 1890, the American historian Alfred Mahan published his seminal work, The Influence of Sea Power upon History. In it, he outlined how naval superiority had brought about Great Britain's rise to hegemony, allowing her to win the titanic wars with France of the 18th century and protect her commercial empire around the world ever since. The Kaiser was enthralled. He ordered all of his naval officers to read the book. The only problem was that he had almost no naval officers to order. Prussia had always been a land power, and Bismarck had never seen any need for more than a small flotilla dedicated to coastal defence. But without a navy, how could Germany ever hope to be a world power like Britain? Its overseas empire, trade and communications would always be dependent on the Royal Navy's goodwill. Without a navy, the British would always look down their noses at Germany and Wilhelm. Fortunately, the Kaiser had finally met a man who shared his vision. Perhaps the most impressive thing about soon-to-be Rear Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz was his ability to sport a forked beard and still be taken seriously. He was a self-made man, having been born to a middle-class lawyer and climbed the small but greasy pole of the Imperial Navy entirely on merit. He was not likeable though, domineering, aggressive and ruthless, but undoubtedly brilliant. "You shall have to get along with him," the Kaiser snapped after receiving one of many complaints about Tirpitz. "That's what I have to do." Wilhelm had first noticed the future father of his navy in 1890 at a dinner hosted for his admirals. When he asked for suggestions on the creation of a fleet, only Tirpitz gave the Kaiser an answer he liked. Germany must have battleships, those equally beautiful and terrifying vessels that Britain used to impose her will on the world. Soon after, he was summoned to Berlin to develop the strategy for a high seas fleet. Like the Kaiser, Tirpitz both admired and loathed the British. He spoke English fluently, read English novels, and held a deep reverence for the Royal Navy, but like Wilhelm, bristled at their patronising attitudes. "Don't they look just like sailors?" he remembered an Englishwoman gasping after seeing a then Lieutenant Tirpitz and the crew of a German warship dock at Gibraltar. The solution to this was simple. Even the greatest sea state in Europe would be more conciliatory towards us if we were able to throw 2 or 3 highly trained squadrons into the political scales, he said. As usual, Wilhelm was enthusiastic but changeable. He swayed between the extravagant heavy battle fleet demanded by Tirpitz and the more limited expansion advocated for by the Naval Secretary Hollmann. Most of the German public, and certainly the Reichstag, which controlled the purse strings on any budget increase, struggled to understand why the country needed more ships. In 1895, the Kaiser had asked for 36 cruisers. The Reichstag gave him 4. There were, of course, genuine arguments in favour of a larger fleet. A navy capable of projecting power and protecting trade routes was important to a country with a growing overseas empire and trade. The German army was divided up between the empire's constituent kingdoms, only merging at the outbreak of war. By contrast, the navy would be a truly national project and serve as a nation-building exercise. Still, the Reichstag was reluctant to spend the money, cutting 12 million from Hollmann's proposed 70 million mark budget in 1896. Soon after, Tirpitz was summoned to also take over as naval minister. In June that year, he delivered a memorandum to Wilhelm detailing his plan for an expansive fleet focused around battleships. Such a heavy navy, good only for the Baltic and North Sea, would be of little use against France and overkill for dealing with Russia. Against Britain though, Tirpitz argued, it would finally give Germany the tools to negotiate effectively. The Admiral carefully laid the groundwork for a new naval bill. Through tedious persuasion and pandering, he prodded the Reichstag into agreeing a 7-year timetable for the construction of a new fleet. In March 1898 it became law, providing for 7 new modern battleships to join the older cluster Germany already possessed. Not enough to seriously trouble the British, but it was a start. 2 years later, with the Boer War raging in South Africa, the Reichstag authorised a second naval law, doubling the size of the future German fleet from 19 to 38 battleships. This massive increase had been made possible by Britain's interception of 3 German mail steamers suspected of carrying contraband to the Boers. London apologised, but throughout the Reich there was outrage. What could Germany do though? Without a navy, she was impotent. The sentiment was seized upon by Tirpitz, who, in a preamble to the new law, set out his thinking. His ideas became known as risk theory. Britain would not risk a war with a Germany that was capable of deploying a powerful fleet. The Royal Navy was scattered around the globe, defending the trade routes of a strung-out empire. The high seas fleet could be concentrated in the North Sea. The odds would favour the Germans. At the very least, the Royal Navy would take a battering in any fight. Thus, the British would not dare risk antagonising them. Eventually, Tirpitz argued they would hopefully be brought into the Triple Alliance on German terms. The Admiral knew how to play to the crowd. Naval law followed naval law after every new crisis, 1906, 1908, 1912, all steadily increasing the budget, even though the Reich usually had to borrow the money. If it was an alliance the Kaiser and Tirpitz genuinely hoped for with this scheme, one suspects Flowers might have done the job more effectively. Instead, the Kaiser's empire now had a new rival to face. In August 1902, another great naval review took place at Spithead to mark the coronation of Edward VII. Queen Victoria, ruler of the British Empire for more than 60 years, had died peacefully on the 22nd of January 1901, though it was not Bertie at her bedside when she passed, but Wilhelm, who had rushed over to Osborne with genuine affection when he heard of his grandmother's final illness. "Why is the standard lowered?" Edward inquired as his mother's casket was carried by ship to Westminster Abbey. "The Queen is dead, sir," the captain said. "Yes, but the King is alive." Despite the losses of the Boer War, the review at Spithead was a very clear statement that Britannia's rule of the waves remained unchallenged. "Some of our rivals have worked with feverish activity, and they are steadily increasing their efforts," the Times' review warned. "They should know that Britain remained vigilant and on guard, prepared to spend whatever funds necessary to maintain its sovereignty of the seas." The Times did not name Britain's rivals, but there was little doubt in the public's mind as to who they could be. The initial steps taken by the Germans towards building a fleet had not immediately concerned the British. In 1898, the Admiralty was more bothered with the naval threat posed by the Franco-Russian Alliance. 9 years earlier, the government had brought in the Naval Defence Act, making it a legal requirement that Britain maintained a number of battleships at least equal to the next two largest navies combined, namely France and Russia. By 1902, however, alarm bells were beginning to ring. The more the composition of the new German fleet is examined, the clearer it becomes that it is designed for a possible conflict with the British fleet, wrote the First Lord of the Admiralty, Lord Selborne. This new hostility came as a shock to Whitehall. Britain had always generally viewed Berlin as a friendly, if slightly erratic power. The Kruger telegram in 1895 had of course outraged public opinion, but Germany was not overtly hostile during the Boer War, certainly when compared to the likes of France and Russia. Indeed, in 1902, Chamberlain was only just giving up on his plans for a Teutonic alliance. German intentions could not be ignored though. It's sometimes stated that the British overreacted to German naval construction. What business was it of theirs if Berlin exercised its sovereign right to create a battle fleet? Christopher Clark is perhaps the most recent example of a historian making this argument. But it to some degree misses the point. The Royal Navy was Britain's lifeline, both its sword and shield. Not just the empire, but the country's very existence depended on it. If it could be bested by a hostile state, Britain's time as a great power would have come to an end. The British fear was not the Kaiser possessing a navy. Nobody in London objected to a German fleet per se. What they had to respond to was a battle fleet whose composition and intention was explicitly to defeat Britons in the North Sea. Tirpitz had thrown down a gauntlet that could not be ignored. With Salisbury retired, it was left to his successors Arthur Balfour and Lord Lansdowne to reorientate British strategy. At 53, the new Prime Minister was an almost ethereal man. Politics seemed to be a sort of tedious hobby for him that got in the way of his true calling, philosophy. "Nothing matters very much and few things at all" was his most famous phrase. The lifelong bachelor's slogan would probably not have been an election winner, but to judge Balfour the politician on it would be unfair. He had risen quickly in his career, mainly through rank nepotism owing to his status as Salisbury's nephew, though also because of his own considerable grit. When given his first job as Chief Secretary for Ireland, he'd surprised everybody by displaying a mixture of competence and firmness. As leader of the House, he by all accounts admirably faced down his Liberal opposite William Gladstone, by then half blind and long past his best, but still the most brilliant orator and statesman of the age. If he became his uncle's heir on the back of his birth status, Balfour nonetheless grasped the opportunity with energy. His most important minister was Lord Lansdowne, like Balfour a scion of the British aristocracy, with vast Irish estates in County Kerry. He'd served in a range of roles from Governor-General of Canada to Viceroy of India, before taking the War Office in 1895, where he was partly blamed for the initial military blunders against the Boers. Meticulously groomed, unimposing and softly spoken, he was a quietly competent administrator, though not a brilliant thinker or statesman. As Foreign Secretary, he agreed with Balfour and Chamberlain that the Empire needed a change of policy going into the new century. He'd been instrumental in forming the Japanese alliance and had initially supported Chamberlain's overtures to Germany, but with the burgeoning naval challenge from the Reich, Lansdowne thought a new approach was necessary. We should of course be careful of viewing the Anglo-German rivalry too deterministically at this point. Hopes for an alliance may have been dashed, but neither Lansdowne nor the Kaiser genuinely considered the other a mortal enemy. None of that, though, could hide the fact Germany would not solve Britain's isolation question. The obvious answer then was to look elsewhere, but with Russia still a competitor in the east and Austria tied at the hip to Berlin, there was only one other power for Britain to turn to. In 1898, a tiny mud brick village on the Upper Nile had nearly caused a war between Britain and its great rival of the previous century, France. A small French military expedition led by the explorer Jean-Baptiste Marchand had trekked across the interior of Africa all the way over to the Sudan. The British, then occupying Cairo, were technically the rulers of this Egyptian colony, but the country was in revolt under the Mahdists, an Islamic apocalyptic group. If the French were able to overpower them and take control of the Upper Nile, British rule in Egypt would become untenable. London thus responded by deploying an Anglo-Egyptian army under the command of Herbert Kitchener to re-establish Egyptian and thus British control over the region. Through a remarkable feat of logistics, he met and annihilated the Mahdist army at the Battle of Omdurman. In the aftermath, he liberated the large quantity of slaves the Mahdists had collected, took their former leader's skull as a collector's item, and then marched to meet the arriving French expedition at Fashoda. Kitchener brought an army of about 1,500 with him. Marchand had 7 other French officers and just over 100 Senegalese troops. The outcome of any battle here would have been a foregone conclusion, but such a battle would have started a war. For a moment it seemed that war may come as tempers flared on both sides of the channel, but Salisbury calculated the French did not want conflict, and he was right. Paris backed down and Marchand withdrew to Djibouti. It was a humiliation the French public would not forget, and did not intend to forgive. When the Boer War came, the French press was probably the most vocally Anglophobic in Europe. The French president told a Russian diplomat that Britain rather than Germany was his nation's chief enemy. Another century in the two nations' long history of competition seemed all but certain. Yet whilst the rest of his country seethed, the new French foreign minister, Théophile Delcassé, sensed opportunity. Delcassé came from a modest background, growing up near the Pyrenees. He had made his career in journalism before marrying a rich widow, who then funded his political ambitions. An unprepossessing man nicknamed the Gnome on account of his small height, he was not what one would call brilliant, but he made up for it through determination, hard work, and an almost fanatical patriotism. Delcassé had been in his job only a week when the Fashoda crisis broke out, and having to negotiate Marchand's withdrawal burned him deeply. The foreign minister shared many of his countrymen's prejudices against British perfidy as a consequence. During the Boer War, he even looked to form a multinational league against them. But when this failed, he was also clear-sighted enough to spot an opportunity and change tact. British weakness had been revealed by the war, but France's chances of recovering Egypt were still remote. Could then this newly chastened Britain be an ally rather than an enemy? The French ambassador in London, Paul Cambon, certainly thought so. Cambon is by far one of the most amusing characters of the pre-war world. Despite spending 20 years in England, he refused to speak a word of the language, thought the British culturally backward, and objected to the foundation of French schools in the country on the grounds that any French children raised there ended up mentally retarded. Nonetheless, he argued that France and Britain were natural partners against the growing power of Germany. For his part, Delcassé was not immediately concerned with the German question. A great believer in the French colonial empire, he primarily saw rapprochement with Britain in the near term as a way to acquire Morocco. The country was viewed as the next obvious extension of France's African imperium. Large parts of it had descended into lawlessness, threatening not least the foreign business communities. In the age of imperialism, this was a prime target for annexation. The problem was that both Germany and Britain had deeply held commercial interests there already, but if London could be persuaded to abandon the country, perhaps in return for a French blessing of their Egyptian occupation, Morocco would be open to Paris. The question was, could the French public, unsurprisingly still hostile to Britain, be convinced of this logic? In 1903, King Edward crossed the Channel for a state visit, hoping to lay the groundwork for future cooperation. His initial reception was frosty. Crowds shouted "Vive Fashoda" as his carriage drove past, but Bertie's charm was infectious. At the theatre, he complimented an actress. "Mademoiselle, I remember applauding you in London, where you represented all the grace and spirit of France," he declared in perfect French. This being Paris, she presumably looked at him as if he had developed leprosy and then corrected his pronunciation. But word of Edward's flattery soon spread throughout the theatre, and then the city. By the time the king left, crowds were shouting "Vive Edward." Delcassé reciprocated this with a visit to London soon after, and on the 8th of April 1904 signed a series of agreements with Lansdowne, forming what would become known as the Entente Cordiale. The phrase is one of those most associated with the outbreak of the First World War, but what was agreed in 1904 should not be overstated. At the time, neither the British nor the French government saw the pact as something directed against Germany. The agreement was not an alliance, it gave no military guarantees. All it really did was settle outstanding colonial disputes. Indeed, in Lansdowne's mind, this was not a radical break with previous British policy. Yet the significance of the Entente cannot be downplayed either. It signalled that Britain's traditional isolation in Europe and tentative friendship with the Triple Alliance was at an end. Its old colonial rival was now to be treated as a reliable partner. Germany's usual strategy of playing London and Paris off against each other was now void. For France, it truly meant the end of Bismarck's system. Once upon a time, she had been kept friendless by the Iron Chancellor's genius. Now it was Germany looking increasingly alone on the European stage. The only potential problem was that France was trying to serve two masters. Britain and Russia were nominally arch rivals, competing for influence throughout Central Asia and the Near East. In 1904, bringing them together seemed like an impractical task. But when it mattered most, Russia could always be counted upon to collapse under its own weight. The Russian Empire inherited by Nicholas II in 1894 was probably the most stable in history. True, the Great Famine of 1891 had reawoken the radicalism briefly crushed by his father. Compared though to the chaotic circumstances most of his predecessors had ascended the throne in, the apparent calm surrounding the new monarch's succession in 1894 seemed to be a cause for optimism. But the omens were bad from the start. "I am not yet ready to be Tsar. I know nothing of the business of ruling," said Nicholas. During the coronation festivities, a stampede at a celebration thrown for the peasantry ended with more than 1,200 dead. Nicholas's instinct was to spend the night in prayer, but he was convinced by his advisors that this would be an insult to the French, whose ambassador was hosting a reception that evening. The Tsar's decision to attend immediately soured his public reputation. Nicholas, at 26, was a small man who had been towered over by his father, both literally and figuratively. Alexander's sudden and untimely death at just 49 had thrust upon Nicholas power he was clearly unprepared to wield. "Have you ever had a serious conversation with him about anything?" asked Alexander when someone suggested giving the Tsarevich a rolling government. In personality, he was charming but diffident and retiring. As governor, he was indecisive and changeable. The Kaiser, who saw it as his duty to bombard Nicholas with advice of varying quality in his early reign, compared his cousin to a pillow, always bearing the imprint of the last person that sat on him. Unlike Wilhelm, there was no hidden genius in Nicholas held back by negative traits, no energy or any particular dynamism, though he did have a good memory and was not unintelligent. His goal was simply to maintain the absolute autocracy handed down to him by his father. In this task, no one could deny his commitment. He worked hard, refusing even a secretary so as to handle all correspondence and paperwork personally. When a new uniform was introduced for the army, Nicholas took it upon himself to test it out by hiking alone for several hours in the Crimea. In government, especially foreign affairs, he regularly tried to conduct his own policies without ministerial aid. All these traits give us the picture of a devoted and pedantic middle manager. They were not the attributes needed in the supreme autocrat of a great empire. The conundrum was made worse by his choice of wife. Alex of Hesse was a love match whom Nicholas had insisted on marrying despite complications relating to her German origins. As a favourite granddaughter of Queen Victoria, she had impeccable familial credentials to go with her great beauty. An Empress of Russia, though, she was not. Extremely shy, humorless and highly strung, Alex could not leave the Petersburg social scene as expected, nor win the public's affection in the way her mother-in-law had. She never spoke a single pleasant word to anyone, said a critical grand dame. She might have been a block of ice, freezing everyone around her. She also struggled to conceive an heir. Between 1895 and 1901, 4 girls were born, none of whom could inherit the Russian throne. A growing desperation to produce a boy meant that as pious Orthodox Christians, both she and Nicholas developed a tendency to associate with charlatans and crackpot mystics. The Imperial Children's French tutor, Pierre Gilliard, later described one of the Tsarevich's more painful episodes. The Tsarevich was in the classroom standing on a chair when he slipped and in falling hit his right knee against the corner of some piece of furniture. The next day he could not walk. On the day after, the subcutaneous hemorrhage had progressed and the swelling which formed below the knee rapidly spread down the leg. The skin, which was greatly distended, had hardened under the force of the blood and caused pain which worsened every hour. The Tsaritsa was at her son's bedside from the first onset of the attack. She watched over him, surrounding him with her tender love and care, trying 1,000 attentions to alleviate his sufferings. The Tsar came the moment he was free. He tried to comfort and amuse the boy, but the pain was stronger than his mother's caresses, or his father's stories, and moans and tears began once more. Every now and then the door opened and one of the Grand Duchesses came in on tiptoe and kissed her little brother, bringing a gust of sweetness and health into the room. His head rested on his mother's arm and his small, deadly white face was unrecognisable. At times the groans ceased and he murmured the one word, "Mummy." His mother kissed him on the hair, forehead and eyes as if the touch of her lips would relieve him of his pain and restore some of the life which was leaving him. Think of the torture that mother, an impotent witness of her son's martyrdom in those hours of anguish, a mother who knew that she herself was the cause of those sufferings, that she had transmitted the terrible disease against which human science was powerless. Now I understood the secret tragedy of her life, how easy it was to reconstruct the stages of that long Calvary. Desperate to relieve the pain, the imperial couple further embraced the mystical, such as the now infamous monk Rasputin, who seemed to be able to ease the boy's suffering. Rasputin's influence over government policy before the war has been exaggerated, but his widely known depravity did little to help the family's reputation, especially because all of this happened behind the high walls of Zarko Selo, an estate outside of St. Petersburg where the imperial family spent much of its time. This was, in fairness, done mainly for reasons of security, but surrounded by thousands of guards and servants, they were shut off from the capital and the new Russia emerging in the country's cities. The empire that Nicholas ruled over was a vast one. The census of 1897 almost certainly gave an underestimate of 125 million inhabitants, though only 55 million were described as Great Russians. Like Austria-Hungary, the Tsar's dominions were incredibly multi-ethnic. Unlike Austria, he was far more determined to promote the Russification of these different groups. Jews probably had it the worst and were regularly subjected to brutal pogroms that the state turned a blind eye to. Roman Catholic Poles, who formed a large bulge on the empire's western border, were generally the most resistant to Orthodox Tsarism and were consequently ruled with an iron fist as punishment for rebellions earlier in the century. Others, such as the steppes' famed Cossack horsemen, were by comparison generously treated because of their loyalty to the regime, whilst many minorities were simply immune to nationalism's call because of their status as semi-literate peasants. Despite the repression and autocratic system of government, the empire was ironically chronically undergoverned. The civil service was smaller than its western counterparts. even though it had to try and manage a range of nationalised industries from railroads to vodka, alongside running the second largest empire on Earth. The Tsarist secret police, the Okhrana, was expected to break up Russia's large revolutionary movement with barely 1,000 members at its height, an embarrassingly small figure by Soviet standards. The juxtaposition to this was the Russian army, always the largest in Europe and able to draw upon a wealth of peasant manpower, so much so that only 20% of eligible men were called up. But like most things in the empire, the army was badly led, suffered from endemic corruption, and struggled to deal with the obvious logistical difficulties of guarding such a large country. The low literacy rate among the troops, about 30 to 40% compared to 90% in the neighbouring German army, was also to cause problems, particularly with morale in the coming conflicts. Troops unable to understand what they were fighting for lacked the same staying power in modern industrial warfare. Outside of an apocalyptic war though, the army was loyal and perfectly suited to the task of internal repression when required. With the Tsar on good personal terms with the Kaiser and the Balkans relatively quiet, the first decade of Nicholas's reign was focused on expansion in the east. Much of this was spearheaded by one of the most capable statesmen in Russia, the finance minister Sergei Witte. The Russian economy Witte had inherited when he came to power under Alexander III had been the most backward of the great powers. Predominantly agrarian, its peasantry, which made up 80% of the population, had only recently been emancipated from serfdom and remained burdened with large debt repayments. In per capita terms, she was poorer than Italy, and its industrial base was contemptible. Witte had begun the transformation of the Russian economy, helping institute a high tariff wall to try and stimulate Russian manufacturing, joining the gold standard and drawing in foreign investment, particularly from the French. One of his pet projects was the Trans-Siberian Railway, a massive scheme meant to open up the far reaches of Siberia and the Far East to trade and colonisation. But Witte also had an ulterior motive. Rather than going entirely through Russia, he planned for part of the railway to go through China. China in the late 19th century was a stagnant and decaying empire, which seemed destined to be carved up by the world's imperial powers. Witte hoped that through this peaceful penetration, as he called it, Russia would be in prime position. Superficially, the logic was not far-fetched. In 1904, a British academic predicted that the railway would soon bring to a close the long Columbian era, in which sea power had dominated the world. Russia's strategic position thus made its domination of Asia almost inevitable. To this end, the Russians slowly crept into China. After joining with Germany and France to reverse a series of Japanese gains in the country, Petersburg then extracted its own concessions, including the right to extend the Trans-Siberian Railway through Manchuria and a lease on Port Arthur. When the Boxer Rebellion broke out in 1899, Russia used it as an excuse to move troops into the region. In reality, the entire project was a costly failure from the start. Port Arthur, its commercial twin Dalny, and the resources needed to connect them via railway cost far more than they would ever seriously produce. The warm water port that Russian jingos prattled on about was basically useless, as Russian trade in the Pacific was negligible, and would be for the foreseeable future. Worse, this expansion now brought them into conflict with the Japanese. Tokyo, at this point still a newcomer on the international stage, had been willing to compromise over Manchuria, but drew a red line at the Korean peninsula, which it was desperate to incorporate into its own empire. Witte, despite his earlier designs on China, now argued strenuously for a peaceful settlement with the Japanese and resigned in protest. But hardliners in the Russian government were horrified at the idea of concession. Gier, before his death, had warned that Korea must not become another Constantinople, blocking the Imperial Navy from reaching the open ocean, as the Turkish Straits did in Europe. In a very loose sense, this logic was sound. The former British Prime Minister, Lord Rosebery, was also at this point talking of putting out stakes in the world for the future. In other words, seizing land that might not be valuable now, but could be in years to come. The logic fell apart though when the stakes ended up skewering oneself instead of others. Nicholas refused to seriously negotiate with the Japanese, and so in 1904, without a declaration of war, they staged a surprise attack on the Russian fleet in Port Arthur. The conflict that followed was a near total disaster for the Russians. Port Arthur held out for 5 months in an epic siege, but was eventually overcome in January 1905. In Manchuria, desperate Russian efforts to drive the Japanese out culminated in the bloody defeat at the giant Battle of Mukden, involving well over 500,000 men. Nicholas's last hope was a desperate ploy of sending Russia's Baltic fleet around the globe to cut the Japanese army off in Manchuria, but the operation was a debacle when the fleet finally arrived off the coast of Korea after a 9-month world tour. It was annihilated in a single battle by the Japanese. Nicholas agreed to peace, negotiated skillfully by Witte. The Treaty of Portsmouth decided that the Japanese would dominate Korea, take half of the island of Sakhalin, and gain Russian concessions in Manchuria. The war had cost Nicholas 400,000 casualties, most of his navy, and sent the empire's finances spiralling. A conflict with Japan would be extremely unpopular and would increase the feeling of dissatisfaction with the ruling authorities, the Minister of War had previously warned in 1903. This was to prove an understatement. In a regime with limited popular legitimacy and a significant revolutionary movement, war and defeat is a dangerous concoction. The effects were unsurprising. The 1905 revolution is inevitably overshadowed by its triumphant successors 12 years later, but the monarchy very nearly collapsed that winter. Had it done so, Russia's defeat by Japan would have looked trivial in comparison. The whole European diplomatic system would have been thrown into meltdown. Indeed, the Kaiser made a serious promise to the large German Baltic community that if the monarchy fell, he would intervene to protect them, though one suspects this probably terrified rather than reassured them. In January 1905, whilst the war was still at its height, a march led by a government informant, Father Gapon, had arrived at the Winter Palace to present a petition to the Tsar, demanding more political rights. The authorities, already jumpy, called out the army, which responded by shooting at least a few hundred of the protesters in a series of confrontations. The atrocity sparked strikes and riots across the empire. As spring came, discontent spread to the peasantry in the provinces, especially where ethnic minorities were dominant. On the Black Sea, the battleship Potemkin mutinied. Again, the Tsar turned to Witte. Witte was no democrat. In fact, he had strenuously argued that only an absolute monarchy could impose the type of modernising reforms he advocated for, but neither was he an ideologue, and understood compromise was necessary. He proposed that Nicholas bow to the necessity of limited concessions. In what became known as the October Manifesto, the Tsar promised new civil rights and the introduction of a Duma, a sort of parliament which would be able to vote on most legislation and scrutinise ministers. Such concessions have a habit of encouraging rather than containing opposition, and that winter was an extremely close-run thing. A battalion from Nicholas's own regiment mutinied. Just enough of the army remained loyal, which allowed for the suppression of the uprisings by the summer of 1906. Nicholas came out of the revolution with his power largely still intact. Indeed, once the government had re-established control of the country, he was able to tweak the electoral laws for the Duma, which gave it a much more conservative composition. He then fired Witte, though only after he had negotiated a large French loan to stave off bankruptcy. But the revolution had weakened Russia at a critical moment. Throughout every court in Europe, everybody knew that for the moment, Russia was no longer a great power. It was an opportunity Germany did not intend to waste. On the 31st of March 1905, the German steamer Hamburg anchored off the Moroccan city of Tangiers. Landing a few hours later was Kaiser Wilhelm II. Greeted by the Sultan's uncle, he was given a white Arabian horse and led through the town's narrow streets to the acclaim of its citizenry. Wilhelm had initially been reluctant to make the visit, considering France's ever-increasing influence in the country. It had been the foreign ministry in Berlin that cajoled the Hamburg's crew into taking him, hoping it would make a statement as to Germany's power in the region, but once ashore the Kaiser was excited. Morocco was an independent country, and he expected Paris to recognise Germany's legitimate interests there, he declared to the French representative in the town. If the Wilhelmstrasse had wanted to make a scene, they had succeeded. Everybody in Europe read the visit as a challenge to France's grip on Morocco, which had been rapidly tightening since the Entente with Britain. Delcassé had originally determined to not even inform Berlin of French intentions with the country. In response, Germany now demanded at the very least either the recognition of its commercial interests, or if not, compensation in the form of colonies elsewhere. But Morocco was really the thin end of the wedge. The Chancellor, Bulow's real hope was that a crisis could be used to break up the burgeoning Anglo-French Entente, perhaps even the Franco-Russian Alliance. This would destroy the ring that was beginning to form around Germany, characterised by the term encirclement, a phrase that was to become all too common in minds at the German Foreign Office over the following decade. The Kaiser did not want war in 1905, was not sure that Germany would win it, and struggled to understand why Morocco was worth risking it. But Bulow and Holstein were convinced that if Germany held its nerve, Britain would crumble, the French would follow, and the Entente would be destroyed to a great enhancement of German prestige. Russia, tied up with war in the east and revolution at home, could do nothing. Having received German support, the Moroccan Sultan rejected a set of French proposed governmental reforms, and Berlin announced it wanted an international conference on the country's future. Delcasse, who had by this point become a sort of bogeyman in the Wilhelmstrasse, would also need to be dismissed, the Germans indicated to Rouvière, the French Prime Minister. Rouvière convinced himself the Germans weren't bluffing and that any war would result in a defeat as great as 1871. This was absurd. Had war broken out in 1905, the French would have had every chance of winning it on their own. The Germans had not yet implemented the lessons from the Russo-Japanese War. Their armies were still clothed in bright blue uniforms, whilst even Wilhelm noted the French 75s, a devastating piece of rapid-firing field artillery that far outmatched anything Germany could cough up, was a reason to back down. Nonetheless, Paris caved and Delcasse was dismissed. Throughout both France and Britain there was shock at this bizarre capitulation. If Berlin had taken such an emphatic victory and gone home, the Moroccan adventure could have been considered a great success. But the Germans now overplayed their hand. Whilst the French tried to offer colonial compensation elsewhere, Bulow continued to demand a conference, where he still hoped to split the Entente once and for all. In both France and Britain, resolve to stand against Germany now stiffened. The new British Foreign Secretary indicated that Paris would have his country's support in any conflict, and even authorised informal military talks over how best Britain could send aid in a European war. When the conference finally convened in 1906, it was a farce. Only Austria supported Germany's demands for the internationalisation of Morocco's police force and financial institutions. Britain, Russia, America, Spain and even Italy, officially Germany's ally, all backed France. If, the Kaiser said later, I had been told about this, that idiotic conference would never have taken place. Germany was offered a few face-saving concessions, but it was clear that their real aim of destroying the Entente had comprehensively failed. Indeed, in Britain, the aggressive stubbornness of German actions had gone a long way to convincing previous Entente skeptics of the agreement's utility. We are face to face with the same state of things which existed in Europe under Charles V, Louis XIV and Napoleon, claimed the advisor Spring Rice. The only issue is either submission to the dictator or a defensive war. This was, of course, hysterical nonsense in 1905, yet even a Foreign Secretary as Germanophile as Lansdowne was incredulous at the Wilhelmstrasse's manner. It represented an obvious change in how Whitehall viewed Berlin. Despite the Kruger telegram and subsequent naval build-up, British statesmen had until 1905 generally tried to give Germany the benefit of the doubt internationally. After, relations were consistently plagued by a deep and abiding suspicion of German intentions. But the Moroccan crisis did not change Germany's course. Stung by humiliation, the lesson Berlin took from it was that international conferences were now useless, as Germany was always likely to be outvoted. This was yet another plank of the old order being removed. The conference had for nearly 100 years been a key defender of European peace, allowing disputes between great powers to be hammered out face to face without war. Germany's decision to abandon them was to have particularly fatal consequences in 1914. The European alliance system was becoming more rigid by the year, just as the last great power was firmly entering into it. In the midst of the Moroccan crisis, a new government had come to power in Britain. By 1905, the Unionists had been in office for a decade and were clearly tired. 2 years earlier, Chamberlain had dramatically resigned from the government and launched a new campaign. tariff reform, a mundane phrase but one that was to tear Britain in two. Since Peel's abolition of the Corn Laws 60 years earlier, Britain had systematically removed the majority of its import duties, becoming a remarkably open nation in terms of commerce. Free trade emerged as an article of faith to the British. Defenders argued that free ports forced manufacturers to innovate, lowered food prices, and more idealistically encouraged the interconnectivity of the world economy and thus global peace. The problem was that few other nations were committed believers. All of the other great powers had adopted a policy of high tariff walls by the turn of the century. Britain's dogged commitment to free trade and refusal to retaliate meant these nations were able to dump their products in the British market at no cost, whilst British manufacturers were unable to do likewise. What this provoked was a gradual but severe relative decline in Britain's once preeminent industrial power. The lack of a secure home market, denying manufacturers the chance to build up economies of scale, meant British capital was discouraged from investing domestically, and found new outlets overseas where the return was likely to be greater. Whilst domestic investment in protectionist Germany and America averaged 12% of GNP in this period, for Britain it was just 7%. By 1914, a full third of British wealth was held in private overseas investment. The result, to quote Sidney Pollard, was that the British growth rate declined markedly, while the growth of other advanced countries, even including France, remained high or even accelerated from the 1890s onward, and for the first time since the mid-18th century, several major industries had arisen in which Britain was no longer in the technical van. By 1900, it should have been apparent to everyone that free trade was a cancer sapping the life force from the British Empire. Britons were still the richest in the world per capita, excepting Americans, and its true London service sector, banking, insurance and OnlyFans, remained preeminent in the world. But between 1900 and 1910, the Board of Trade reported that wages were stagnant. One man was brave enough to present a solution. In 1902, Chamberlain had come away from an imperial conference with the Dominions frustrated. There was no question of their loyalty to Britain. All had just provided substantial support in the Boer War, but it was increasingly apparent that with only cultural ties and a shared monarch binding them together, it would be near impossible to agree on joint policies. The empire needed some glue to unify it, or Seeley's prediction of disintegration would start to seem like prophecy. As a businessman first and foremost, Chamberlain was also deeply sensitive to British economic decline. Tariff reform, or imperial preference as it became known, was the solution to this. Britain would maintain free trade within the empire, imports from the dominions would not be taxed, but those from foreign powers would now be subjected to a moderate duty. Touring the country with his immense powers of oratory, Chamberlain declared that in one fell swoop, tariffs would bind the empire together, arrest Britain's industrial decline, and raise a useful chunk of revenue to pay for social reforms like pensions. A positive cause to rally around could even re-energise the Unionists after nearly 10 years of continual government. In sum, it was a completely sensible suggestion and long overdue. The problem was Britain's quasi-religious faith in free trade, and specifically the cheap food it brought. In the Unionist Party alone, there were around 83 free traders out of 392 MPs once Chamberlain made his case. Balfour should have simply steamrolled them and pushed tariff reform through. An election would not have been needed as Peel had not called one to repeal the Corn Laws. Instead, Balfour played a bizarre game of trying to appease both sides. The result was inevitably confusion and farce. The Liberal opposition, once hopelessly divided over the Boer War, reunited around free trade. Tariffs, they warned, would raise the price of food. That food was to become dearer under them anyway, whilst free trade continued to stagnate the working man's wage, they seem not to have predicted. In 1905, an exhausted Balfour resigned in favour of the Liberal leader Henry Campbell Bannerman, who quickly called an election that ended in a landslide victory. For the first time since 1885, the Liberal Party had a majority in the House of Commons. What a smash, Chamberlain hummed when he heard the results. The free trade wing of the Unionists had been practically annihilated in the Liberal wave. The rump that remained would from now on be firmly protectionist. Chamberlain could look forward to a comeback in the 1911 election, probably as Prime Minister. It wasn't to be. A few months later he suffered a debilitating stroke. Though he relearnt to walk, his powers of oration were gone, and with them his political career. The Liberals now had complete freedom. CB, as the new Prime Minister was known, is one of those men who seem to have ended up in the position by accident of history. His only three real passions were, in George Dangerfield's words, his wife, the French nation, and his collection of walking sticks. Although Bannerman was by no means idle before his unfortunate, though hardly unexpected death in 1908, power throughout the following decade of Liberal rule was generally wielded by a triumvirate of ministers beneath him. The first of these was the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, Herbert Asquith. Squiffy, as he was known, had been the most prominent Liberal over the preceding years, whilst Chamberlain had toured the country making speech after speech in favour of tariff reform. Asquith had shadowed him, presenting the case for free trade. He was a witty speaker with an undoubtedly brilliant mind, forged at Oxford and the Bar. When Campbell Bannerman got into difficulty in the Commons, his usual command was, "Go and get the sledgehammer." A few minutes later, Asquith would invariably appear to dispatch whichever Unionist opponent had challenged the Prime Minister with withering invective. That he usually did this whilst completely sloshed was even more impressive. His friend and colleague Richard Haldane initially seemed harder to place. A successful lawyer and brilliant amateur philosopher, he was the most able man in the new Liberal government and seemed destined for one of the great offices of state. But Haldane demurred. "What about the War Office?" he asked, referring to the department responsible for the British Army. "Nobody will touch it," Campbell Bannerman moaned. "Then give it to me," Haldane replied. The Boer War had highlighted the deficiencies in an organisation that had for too long been run by fossils bent on scuppering all proposals for reform. The Escher Report in 1904 listed a number of obvious changes required and resulted in the formation of institutions like the Committee of Imperial Defence to coordinate strategy. But by 1905 little else had been done. Two Unionist war ministers, both good men with sensible if very ambitious ideas, had failed because of opposition from one quarter or another. Army reform seemed like a career graveyard, but over 3 years Haldane was to transform the British Army into the small yet rigorously trained and well-equipped force that provided the nucleus of the army that in 1918 broke the Hindenburg Line. Finally, there was Sir Edward Grey, the man who was to dominate British foreign policy for the next 10 years. Grey had had a less glittering career than his two colleagues. Coming from an old northern aristocratic family, he'd been a disinterested student at Oxford, preferring real tennis to his degree, and had only taken a fancy to politics as a way to keep occupied. But he'd shown himself intelligent and competent as Lord Rosebery's understudy during the brief Liberal government of 1892–95. On the imperialist wing of his party, he took little interest in the Empire or its affairs. The greatest supporter of the French Entente in cabinet, he disliked foreigners and spoke no other language. One of the most senior ministers in government, he preferred birdwatching at his Northumberland estate to parliamentary business. Grey's conduct as Foreign Secretary has inevitably come under closer scrutiny than basically any other holder of that office, for it was Grey who brought Britain into the war. He was naturally secretive in style, not unfairly taking a dim view of Parliament's understanding of foreign affairs. In language, he was evasive, rarely giving a straight answer. He depended heavily on a small inner circle of advisers to make policy. Bertie, Hardinge, Nicholson, Tyrrell, Crowe are names that will periodically appear throughout the rest of this documentary. The one common denominator among them all was a deeply held suspicion of Germany. Grey himself always harboured a dislike for the Germans, in his memoirs dating this feeling back to his time as Undersecretary, where he found their negotiating manner abrupt and rough. Inheriting the Foreign Office in the midst of the Moroccan crisis thus only served to confirm Grey's feelings. He was never what one would describe as an outright Germanophobe, and he was not adverse to regularly working with Berlin, but his ever-present mistrust of Germany's intentions was to underline everything Grey did. By contrast, he had long been a supporter of better relations with France and had warmly welcomed the Entente. Trevelyan, many years ago, identified it as the first and most important aspect of Grey's policy. As John Charmley points out, there was a clear difference in the way Lansdowne and Grey interpreted the agreement. The former always saw the Entente as what it had originally been intended for, a limited settling of colonial disputes. Grey, on the other hand, declared in October 1905 that the spirit of the Entente was more important than its exact terms. In Kennedy's words, Grey regarded British interests as virtually identical with the French. His reasoning for doing so was that England had always drifted or deliberately gone into the opposition to any power which establishes hegemony in Europe. Under Grey, a temporary diplomatic alignment moved further and further into the realm of permanent alliance. The new cabinet then left the Liberals with an eclectic policy programme. Grey and the Imperialists were committed to the Entente with France and countering what they viewed as an aggressive Germany, but Campbell-Bannerman and the more pacifist wing, which included most of the parliamentary party, aimed to pursue the traditional liberal line of economy, which in the era before a welfare state usually meant defence cuts. The man meant to square this circle was the new First Sea Lord. Jackie Fisher did not in appearance strike one as the greatest admiral since Nelson. Small and stocky with an odd-looking face, Massey records that his grey eyes were set far apart, their heavy eyelids giving them a sort of almond shape. A strange, almost yellow tint affected his skin to the extent it was rumoured Fisher was actually Malayan. The First Sea Lord did not pay much attention to this. His parents were both very handsome. Why I am ugly, he once mused, is one of those puzzles of physiology which are beyond finding out. Charming, bombastic, supremely self-confident and undoubtedly brilliant, he was either the genius that saved the Royal Navy from potential cataclysm, or a senile social climber with an inflated opinion of his abilities depending on who you talk to. When the King suggested he should occasionally consider other opinions, Fisher snapped, "Why should I waste my time looking at all sides when I know my side is the right side?" Apart from the service, the main features of Fisher's life were his family, to whom he was devoted, and the Bible. Perhaps only the Christian faith came before the Navy. The Dean of Westminster once felt required to warn Fisher of spiritual indigestion after he heard of him attending 4 sermons in a single day. Energetic and slightly neurotic, the relentless Bible-quoting Fisher's main task was to counter the German naval build-up whilst also reducing naval expenditure. The way to do so, he decided, was to revolutionise Britain's trident. Unchallenged for a century, the Royal Navy in 1905 was strung out around the globe, divided into small squadrons lazily guarding Britain's many overseas outposts. Steamrollering his opponents both in government and the Navy, Fisher decided to recall most of the fleet to home waters, combining it into one large armada capable of smashing the Germans in the North Sea. 154 older and obsolete vessels, too weak to fight and too slow to run away as Fisher famously called them, were scrapped. He began the replacement of coal with oil, introduced better rations for the men and implemented more rigorous training procedures. The savings these measures brought reduced naval estimates dramatically, but the First Sea Lord had only just begun. His aim wasn't to simply counter the Germans, he meant to put the fear of God into them. In 1904 he began designing a new battleship, one which would outclass everything else on the ocean. On the 10th of February 1906, HMS Dreadnought was launched at Portsmouth. She was the largest, fastest and most powerful battleship in the world. 18,000 tons, capable of 21 knots, driven by modern turbine engines and crucially armed with 10 12-inch guns. It was the most terrifying advancement in naval technology for decades, capable of outrunning and outgunning all other battleships. And it immediately rendered the Royal Navy's vast numerical superiority completely worthless. The German Navy, after an initial code brown and change of pants, accepted the challenge. Within 2 years they had launched their own dreadnought, SMS Nassau. The Liberals now had a problem. Dreadnought had originally been built as a cost-saving exercise, a way to streamline the fleet and reduce the number of battleships overall. Instead, it looked like she was about to send the naval arms race into overdrive. Grey's solution was to reach out to another former enemy. Throughout the 19th century, no power caused as much consternation in London as Russia. Like a glacier, its expansion was slow but relentless, moving down towards Constantinople, Persia and the Punjab with apparently unstoppable force. To the Russians, Britain was a hypocritical and obtuse power, blocking the natural avenues of her expansion whilst gobbling up anywhere its navy's guns could fire on without interference. To the British, the small clique of aristocrats who governed in St. Petersburg were serial promise breakers, determined to force Britain from the Mediterranean, Persian Gulf and even India. But the competition went deeper than that. Russia was autocratic and monarchical, Britain free and liberal, Britain the land of the industrialist and capital, Russia of peasant and church. All of these views were of course caricatures to one degree or another, But the juxtaposition between the two empires' outlooks was very real. Animosity then seemed the natural condition of the 19th century, and to begin with it looked like the 20th would be no different. In October 1904, when the Russian Baltic Fleet began its doomed journey around the world, a group of small ships was spotted. Though still only in the North Sea, the Russians apparently believed they were Japanese torpedo boats and opened fire for 20 minutes. In fact, this armada was a fleet of mere fishing vessels from Britain. 2 men were killed and other 6 injured. In London there was fury. It is almost inconceivable that any men calling themselves seamen, however frightened they might be, could spend 20 minutes bombarding a fleet of fishing boats without discovering the nature of their target, raged the Times. The Russians were initially unapologetic, but under pressure from their French ally, and with the Royal Navy's home fleet now shadowing their own, agreed to refer the case to international arbitration. The incident hardly boded well for relations, and many in Britain somberly predicted a new confrontation once the Russians had dispatched their Japanese ally. But to the surprise of everyone, when the Russian fleet arrived at the Straits of Tsushima, it was annihilated. Soon after, Russia sued for peace, humiliated on the international stage and in turmoil domestically. The Tsar's defeat suddenly placed Britain in the most favourable diplomatic position she had occupied for decades. The question was what exactly to do with it. For Grey, the answer was obvious. Britain should take the opportunity to reach a thorough settlement with Russia, resolving all outstanding territorial disputes and forging a new relationship with her. Unlike Lansdowne and the French Entente though, Grey did have Germany at the forefront of his mind when negotiating. A Russian pact would allow the Liberals to maintain their defence cuts by freeing up resources from the east and leaning more heavily on St. Petersburg there. Focus could then be directed back to Europe and Germany. It's true Grey publicly rejected this accusation, in his memoirs writing that the primary and cardinal object of the agreement was the security of the Indian frontier. In 1912 he went even further in responding to one critic. Previous to the Anglo-Russian agreement, it was our policy to head back Russia in every direction. We did it in the Crimean War, we did it in the time of Lord Beaconsfield, and we did it in recent years in the Far East. For years I've held that this was a mistaken policy, and that it would be better to come to an agreement with Russia by which she would not acquire influence or use what influence she had to disturb our Indian frontier. That was the fons et origo of the Anglo-Russian agreement. This was basically the same logic Lansdowne had used when crafting the Entente with France, a limited settlement of colonial disputes meant to give Britain more diplomatic freedom. But it's difficult to trust Grey as being completely truthful here. Whilst negotiating in 1907, he was also writing, "An entente between Russia, France and ourselves would be absolutely secure. If it is necessary to check Germany, it could then be done." Indeed, Sir Charles Hardinge, the former ambassador to St. Petersburg and newly appointed permanent Under-Secretary at the Foreign Office, declared, "It is far more essential for us to have a good understanding with Russia in Asia and the Near East than for us to be on good terms with Germany." The idea of some kind of agreement with Russia to end the Great Game was not exactly new. Defending the northern frontier of the Indian Empire was a constant drain on men and money, and was only likely to become more so once new railways allowed the Tsar to finally supply his many legions in that remote part of the world. Lansdowne had thus tentatively endorsed seeking some sort of pact with Russia from 1903 onwards, but Balfour and Lansdowne had imagined this as a sort of mirror agreement to the French Entente, a specific settling of colonial grievances with no real wider purpose. The difference with Grey was he also saw it as a way of countering Berlin. Initially, the Russians were uninterested. Nicholas himself favoured a formal reconciliation with Germany rather than Britain to escape his predicament. Berlin, so the Tsar thought, had been generous during the war, even coaling the Russian fleet whilst the British were threatening to destroy it. That Germany had also used the crisis to wring highly favourable trade terms from Russia, he seemed to inexplicably forget. On the 24th of July 1905, Nicholas met Kaiser Wilhelm on board his yacht in the Gulf of Finland, where they signed the Treaty of Bjorko. The terms were for a mutual defensive pact and a commitment from Russia to bring France into the agreement as soon as possible. For a moment it looked as if the Kaiser had single-handedly broken Germany's burgeoning encirclement. But Nicholas had signed the document without consulting his ministers, who were horrified when they heard the terms. How on earth could Russia presume to dictate to France at this point, when Paris was in the middle of their own confrontation with Germany over Morocco, and was being expected to save Russia's economy with a large loan? Lambsdorff, the foreign minister, declared Bjorko a trick meant to break the Entente with France and alienate Britain. Even Witte, a long-time Germanophile, remained bitter at Germany's behaviour in the recent trade negotiations. Chastised, Nicholas withdrew from the deal, earning him a rebuke from the Kaiser. This of course didn't mean the generally cordial relationship between Berlin and St. Petersburg soured. The two monarchs met on their yachts again in 1907 and quickly resumed their friendship, only slightly dampened by an impromptu speech from Wilhelm where he boasted about his navy and said he hoped Nicholas would soon build another. The only thing missing, fumed a Russian aide, is for him to slap him in the face. There were no slaps, but nor was there any more talk of a formal alliance either. The Tsar was now left with little choice. The British were holding out a hand, he could no longer afford to ignore it. The terms of the Anglo-Russian agreement, finally signed in 1907, dealt with Afghanistan and Tibet, but ultimately came down to a deal over Persia. Russia was to take a sphere of influence in the north, Britain in the south. The considerations were purely strategic. Oil was only discovered by chance within ease of access for the British a few years later. For Whitehall, the relationship was a mixed blessing. On the one hand, the pact allowed enough people in the Foreign Office and Calcutta to delude themselves that attention and resources could now be permanently fixed on the German threat. Whilst defence budgets ballooned in Europe over the following years, the Indian governments barely increased at all. But it did not end either suspicion or criticism of Russia. To the liberals, the Tsar was the jailer of Poles and oppressor of Jews. For the Tories, he remained a threat to the empire. Whereas the Entente with France generally always had widespread support, the appeasement of Russia was really driven by a few policymakers at the top, namely Grey, Hardinge and Nicholson. In the Lords, Curzon, former Viceroy of India, bitterly condemned the treaty for giving up our advanced positions in Tibet. The agreement was always likely to come under strain. Persia was practically descending into chaos internally at this point, and the Russians were soon making the most of it by moving troops into the country. They also continued to work on railways in the region, making invasion of India ever more feasible. Grey had a subtle solution to this, he ignored it, instead blithely taking Russian assurances of friendship if it would allow him to focus on Germany. This to the extent Spring Rice, newly appointed in Tehran, bemoaned the tendency to take for granted that Russia means what she says when she says she does not intend to take up a position in Persia which would facilitate the invasion of India. For St. Petersburg then, the agreement was an excellent deal considering the circumstances. Unlike Grey, the Russians made it extremely clear to the Germans that the pact was in no way aimed at them. To St. Petersburg, for now at least, it was solely about salvaging their position in Persia. Though it's true the Anglophile ambassador to London, Beckendorf, hoped it would eventually develop into a more elaborate friendship. Nonetheless, the significance of the agreement should not be downplayed. For a decade, Russian expansion had been focused on its periphery. The agreement with Britain was, at least in spirit, an abrogation of that policy. With its imperialist designs elsewhere blunted, the Russians once more turned their attention back to Europe, just as the continental tinderbox was beginning to look particularly flammable. In 1908, the Balkans roared back to the front of the international stage, threatening as usual to drag all Europe into war. Ironically, the troubled peninsula had been relatively quiet for more than a decade. Though Austria and Russia were no longer bound by the Three Emperors League, they if anything seemed to have gotten along better outside of its constraints. In 1897, they had informally agreed to both maintain the status quo in the region. And when tested by a revolt against the Turks in Macedonia in 1903, they had cooperated to suggest reforms for the Sultan to implement. The underlying variable here, however, was Russia's focus on the east and Austria's wary respect for the Great Bear's power. Now, with its Asian aspirations checked, St. Petersburg was beginning to once more look west, just as Vienna sensed opportunity to take advantage of Russian weakness. The Habsburgs had always defended their prerogative to legally annex Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Balkan territory it occupied since 1878. A secret article of the old Three Emperors League had stated Austria asserted the right to annex these provinces at whatever moment she shall deem opportune, and the claim had been repeated since. Russia had never contested this in principle, though it reserved the right to impose conditions. For 30 years, Vienna had preferred to avoid this awkward conversation, but in 1908 the occupation statute was due to expire. The Austrian Foreign Minister, Alois von Ehrenthal, thought now the time to formally incorporate the territory. Tall, slightly stooped, with fine, regular features and hooded eyes from which he peered out of short-sightedly, Aehrenthal had come from a family of Czech aristocrats and had risen steadily through the Austrian diplomatic service, serving as a successful ambassador to, of all places, Russia before finally accepting the Foreign Office in 1906. He was wholeheartedly committed to the Habsburgs' civilising mission and deeply conservative, yet was by no means a mere reactionary. Indeed, it was his openness to more creative solutions that was to lead to his infamous reputation. The advantages of annexation were obvious. Superficially, it would serve as a cheap prestige boost for an empire desperately in need of it. For Aehrenthal, though, absorbing Bosnia would also be the start of a more ambitious foreign policy. A passionate Austrian patriot, he was deeply concerned by the monarchy's growing dependence on Germany. The Kaiser's description of Vienna as a brilliant second at the Algeciras conference in 1906 still annoyed him. A bold international statement such as this would prove the Habsburgs remained an independent great power. Once annexed, Aehrenthal imagined the Slavs would be given their own autonomous kingdom within the monarchy, solving that question and further revitalising the empire on the international stage. The clinching argument came in the summer of 1908, when the Young Turks forced the Ottoman Sultan to proclaim a constitution and establish a parliament. Announcing plans to overhaul the imperial government, rumours reached Vienna that Bosnia, still legally a Turkish territory, would soon be offered its own political settlement, pulling the rug out from under Austria. Aehrenthal thus moved quickly to prepare the ground for formal annexation. To do so, however, he first had to square Russia. Despite his subsequently infamous reputation throughout the Slav world, Aehrenthal was actually a firm believer in improving relations with St. Petersburg. Austria's future, the former ambassador to Russia thought, lay in cooperation between the three great monarchies of Europe, a sort of revived Three Emperors League, at least in spirit if not in name. He thus hoped settling the Bosnian issue would be the prelude to a new era of détente between the two empires. History does so love its ironies. The new Russian foreign minister, Izvolsky, had no objection to the Austrian annexation, providing the Tsar was amply compensated. In particular, he had his mind on a revision of the Straits Agreement. Currently, commercial shipping could navigate the small waterway that separated east from west, but foreign warships were banned. If Russia could revise this, allowing her navy alone to move between the Black and Mediterranean seas, she would have won a major strategic prize. On a more personal level, Izvolsky would have won fame for himself, inevitably part of the calculation for a man as vain as the foreign minister was. Izvolsky came from a prosperous gentry family with good connections at court, though they were basically new money in Russian terms. No one doubted the foreign minister's intelligence. He was well read, intellectually curious, and could be charming. But he combined this with narcissism and excessive concern for his public image. He had experienced a uniquely wide range of postings in his diplomatic career, from the Balkans, Rome and Germany to Japan and the United States. Though he still felt unprepared for the Foreign Office when he was appointed in 1906, in politics he was a liberal by Tsarist standards, supporting the Duma and holding public opinion in high regard. His focus on the Straits can in this context be understood. Educated Russians yearned for a foreign policy success to expunge the lingering humiliation of the Japanese War, and it's hard to overstate the hypnotising effect Constantinople and the Dardanelles had. 40% of Russian exports went through this small waterway. It was through here Russia traded the Ukrainian grain that was so important to her balance of payments. But there was a deeper fascination. Though still ruled by the Islamic Sultan, Constantinople remained the spiritual home of Orthodox Christianity. The city of Constantine and Justinian. If Russia was the third Rome, as her statesmen often referred to her, surely her national destiny was to liberate the second. Now, Izvolsky's proposal in 1908 was not outright seizure of Constantinople. Ironically, the port and St. Petersburg were on better terms than they had ever been at this point in time, but allowing Russian warships to finally navigate the Straits would be a major coup. The current setup was an international one, and it would require the agreement of all of the great powers to change it, but Izvolsky was convinced that if Austria agreed, his French and British allies would soon fall in line. On the 16th of September 1908, he and Aehrenthal met at the Moravian estate of the current Austrian ambassador to Russia, Leopold von Berchtold. The atmosphere was not a cordial one. Aehrenthal despised Izvolsky for his liberalism and saw him as an obstacle to his grander plans in Europe. Izvolsky despised Aehrenthal for, in his words, throwing a bomb at his feet a year earlier by unilaterally announcing Austrian plans for new railway building in the Balkans. Negotiations to finalise the quid pro quo were conducted in a single day, and there was subsequently enormous controversy about what had been agreed at Bulow. No formal minutes were taken and no accurate record was ever agreed upon, but it seems possible to establish a basic outline of what happened. As expected, the Russians agreed to support the Austrian annexation of Bosnia, and the Austrians agreed to support Russian military access to the Straits. Despite Izvolsky's pleas, Aehrenthal would offer no territorial compensation to Serbia, who claimed the neighbouring province filled with fellow Slavs. The main problem though was that no timetable for these events was firmly established. It's clear from his own correspondence that Aehrenthal accepted Izvolsky's belief some sort of conference would be needed to get the other great powers to agree to the changes. Izvolsky was of course playing a very dangerous game. He well understood that Russian public opinion might recoil at letting the Habsburgs annex fellow Slavs, especially if he was unable to open the Straits, something the British had long been opposed to, but he was willing to roll the dice. Unfortunately, there is always snake eyes. When he arrived in Paris on the 4th of October to sound out the French, he found a letter from Aehrenthal stating the announcement of the annexation would be in 3 days' time, and the Austrian foreign minister appears to have subsequently boasted about tricking Izvolsky as to the exact timing of the proclamation. This could only have been by a few days, as Izvolsky knew the annexation would be made public by the end of October at the latest, but those extra few days would have allowed him to broach the matter with his allies before Vienna's announcement of annexation upstaged him and swallowed everything. Gray was sympathetic to Izvolsky's position and said he was open to revising the Straits Agreement, but couldn't possibly commit to it at that point, with British public opinion already excited by the Bosnian annexation. Izvolsky gave way gracefully and agreed with his British and French counterparts that a conference should be called to discuss the annexation and possible compensation for Serbia. This was where the Aehrenthal-Izvolsky pact collapsed. The Austrian foreign minister hated the idea of a conference, and again flatly refused to even discuss compensation for Serbia. The Germans, happy to have an opportunity to punish Russia for siding with the British since 1905, backed Vienna. Neither Britain or France cared enough to press the issue, and so Aehrenthal swaggered off with his prize, leaving Izvolsky with egg on his face. The reaction in Russia was predictable. Austria had just annexed a province filled with fellow Slavs and was claiming it had Russian support in doing so. Petersburg, on the other hand, had got nothing. The Prime Minister Stolypin was furious at having been kept in the dark about the negotiations. The Russian press relentlessly published article after article condemning Izvolsky and his abandonment of Bosnia. At a meeting of the Council of Ministers in November 1908, Izvolsky admitted he had underestimated the impact of the annexation on Russian public opinion. This was true, although Aehrenthal had undoubtedly acted with all the low cunning of a late Habsburg statesman by announcing the annexation early. Izvolsky had sown much of this whirlwind himself by trying to trade Bosnia for a concession the British and French were never guaranteed to back. Indeed, even if they had done, it's unlikely that something as intangible as shipping rights in the Straits could have assuaged the outrage of the Russian press, sympathetic as it increasingly was to Serbia and the Balkan Slavs. The foreign minister admitted his fault, but argued the only realistic solution was to continue pushing for an international conference. As discussed earlier, neither Berlin or Vienna liked conferences anymore, not unfairly believing the aligned system meant they would be outvoted at any such meeting. The crisis rattled on throughout the winter and into the spring of 1909, as the Russians tried to force the issue, but by then the Austrians were bored, and Aehrenthal decided to end the matter once and for all by threatening to publish documents signed by Izvolsky that promised to support the annexation. Finally, on the 22nd of March 1909, Germany also stepped in and issued what some Russians later described as an ultimatum. Russia was basically told to recognise the annexation or face the consequences. It goes without saying that war was an impossibility for Russia in 1909. Still wounded by the Manchurian debacle, the Tsar's intelligence reported that Germany's superiority in artillery, heavily invested in since the Tangiers crisis, in particular made conflict impractical. Besides, the French even more alarmingly made it clear they had no interest in getting involved in a spat over the Balkans. A key but overlooked detail that shows there was still flexibility within the alliance system. Powers still did not mindlessly back their allies at all times. The result was that St. Petersburg finally obliged, the Bosnian annexation was recognised, the straits remained closed to Russian warships. The Bosnian crisis, in hindsight, seems like many of the pre-war spats, a storm in a teacup. But if you had to pick one incident before 1914 that explained the conflict, this would be a good contender. and it's easy to see why the crisis permanently poisoned relations between Austria, Serbia and Russia. Until then, St. Petersburg and Vienna had been on relatively friendly terms. After it, there was no question of the détente Aehrenthal had once hoped for. Indeed, even German relations with Russia were burned by the crisis. Nicholas, who had just over a year earlier gone out of his way to ensure Germany took no offence at the agreement with Britain, now fumed at the Kaiser's guarded threat of war in 1909. It's true, he wrote to his mother, that the form and method adopted by the Germans in their treatment of us was rude, and that we won't forget. I think that once again they were seeking to split us from France and England, but once again did not succeed. Such methods generally lead to the opposite results. Izvolsky survived as foreign minister for another 18 months before being given the comfortable and well-paid sinecure of the ambassadorship in Paris. His ideas survived him in office though. Izvolsky's argument that Russia's future was in the West for the time being remained government policy. In 1909, Russia had been too weak to achieve his ambitious aims, but with the country recovering rapidly, everyone was certain that when the next challenge came, they would not be humiliated again. When the guns opened fire in 1914, Izvolsky shouted, "This is my war." The whole world is now watching the rivalry between German and English shipbuilding, Sir Edward Grey told the German ambassador in 1908. The naval revolution that had occurred with the launching of Dreadnought 2 years earlier fundamentally altered the dynamic of the arms race. The pre-Dreadnought battleships of both nations were now basically obsolete, and Tirpitz would have to begin his project from scratch. Indeed, the entire concept of the Rear Admiral's risk strategy was looking ever more dubious. Instead of ignoring the German build-up, the Royal Navy had responded by recalling many of its ships to home waters and streamlining the fleet. Instead of conceding to Germany a world political freedom, the British had tightened their links with France and sided against Berlin over Morocco. Even worse, continuing the race and matching Dreadnought's size would mean the Kiel Canal, Germany's newly built waterway that linked the Baltic and North Seas, would have to be widened at enormous expense so as to accommodate the huge ships. As Paul Kennedy says, well before the outbreak of war, it had become clear that, far from achieving British respect and securing concessions, the naval expansion was creating a lasting enmity. Switching back to a more limited cruiser-focused expansion, a force capable of actually operating beyond Cherbourg, would now have been the most obvious solution, but Tirpitz was unmoved. If the British built Dreadnoughts, so would Germany. He continued with the full support of the Kaiser, who remained convinced by the Admiral's logic that the only way Germany would ever be able to achieve Weltmacht, world power, was to possess a navy that could challenge Britain's. And so, taking advantage of a swelling in national patriotism after the Moroccan crisis, the Reichstag passed an amendment to the naval law in 1906, which provided for a changeover to Dreadnought construction. The arms race thus moved to a much higher and much more expensive level. For the Liberal government in Britain, Berlin's decision to escalate the arms race caused a crisis. When Fisher had originally begun the construction of Dreadnought under the Unionists, the then First Lord of the Admiralty, Lord Cawdor, had outlined a programme for building 4 a year. In this age of fiscal orthodoxy, borrowing was generally avoided, so the government planned to fund this increase with the budget surplus. But the new Liberal government wanted instead to spend money on social reform, pensions and unemployment insurance, and defence expenditure was the obvious place to find the money. The Cawdor programme was thus cut, 1 ship in 1906, 1 in 1907 and 2 in 1908. Asquith, Prime Minister from 1908 after the retirement and death of the very old Campbell Bannerman, thought this steady pace sufficient to keep ahead of the Germans. It was with stunned silence then that the Cabinet received the First Lord of the Admiralty, Reginald McKenna's request for 6 Dreadnoughts in 1909, followed by another 6 in 1910 and another 6 in 1911. The calculations, McKenna plainly stated, were based upon German naval plans. The laying down of Nassau in 1907 had been followed that year by Westphalen, Rhineland and Posen. In 1908, the Reichstag had passed another naval bill increasing the rate of Dreadnought construction from 3 to 4 per year for 4 years. If, as originally planned, the Royal Navy only ordered 4 Dreadnoughts in 1909, by 1912 Germany would have 13 and Britain 16. Liberal arrogance and cost-cutting had left the British Empire in an unthinkably perilous position, and the Admiralty made its feelings known to McKenna. Worse, there were constant rumours that Germany was secretly speeding up its naval construction. The great Krupp manufacturing works in Essen were said to be holding huge warehouses of naval gun barrels, and the Admiralty thought it a practical certainty that if this were true, Germany would actually have 17 dreadnoughts by 1912. If she used all of her dockyards capable of building dreadnoughts, 7 in total, she would have 21. This was undoubtedly verging on the hysterical, and in Cabinet the First Lord was vigorously opposed by 2 up-and-coming ministers in the Liberal Party, David Lloyd George and a very young man named Winston Churchill. Both were firmly committed to the radical wing of the party and refused to consider the extra expenditure. Lloyd George, who as the newly appointed Chancellor would have to find the money, thought the parliamentary party would never accept the extra cost, whilst Churchill rebutted the idea that the Germans were building more dreadnoughts in secret on the basis that the Reichstag would still have had to publicly authorise them. Churchill was indeed correct. What had actually sparked all of these rumours was the Germans placing a dreadnought order a few months early so that a Danzig shipyard didn't have to lay off any of its workers. No new ships were being added to the build schedule, nor were the completion dates of the ordered ships being brought forward. But as the Germans refused all British requests to audit this for themselves, no one in London really knew. Asquith was then in a quandary. In January 1909, the Admiralty increased its demands further, now asking for 8 dreadnoughts in 1 year. Lloyd George, Churchill and the other radicals in Cabinet wanted the original 4. Haldane, Grey and McKenna wanted at least 6, perhaps 8. The Prime Minister solved the crisis by suggesting that the original 4 dreadnoughts be laid down as expected, with another 4 to follow if close monitoring of the Germans revealed them to be necessary. To get the bill through Parliament, McKenna declared in the Commons, no matter what the cost, the safety of the country must be assured. We do not know, as we thought we did, the rate at which German construction is taking place. This revelation threw the Unionists into outrage. A Tory MP coined the phrase, "We want 8 and we won't wait." Soon this cry was ringing throughout the country. Invasion literature, novels that base their stories around a potential German conquest of Britain, was extremely popular in this era, and the news that the German Navy may soon outclass Britain sent these feelings into near hysteria. Still, Lloyd George and Churchill refused to concede. An outraged Fisher offered to name the extra 4 ships Winston, Churchill, Lloyd and George if they would allow them to be built. How they would fight, he chortled. Finally, in July 1909, it was revealed Austria planned at least 3 dreadnoughts of her own, and Italy soon announced another 4. The Admiralty's case became irresistible and the 4 contingency orders were placed. In the end, a curious and characteristic solution was reached, Churchill later said. The Admiralty had demanded 6 ships, the economists offered 4, and we finally compromised on 8. It was a painful decision. The Liberals had spent their first years in office trying to reduce defence expenditure. Now 8 dreadnoughts in 12 months literally blew their work out of the water. Naval spending rocketed from $32.2 million in 1908 to 1909 to $48.8 million in 1913 to 1914. But as Churchill later magnanimously admitted, it had been the correct choice. The precariousness of Britain's position echoed around the Empire. That same year, New Zealand and Australia decided to fund a battle cruiser each for the Royal Navy's use. In 1913, Malaya gifted a Queen Elizabeth-class battleship, and the Conservative government in Canada eventually tried to offer an outright gift of $35 million to pay for the building and upkeep of another 3, though this was ultimately blocked by the Liberal-controlled Senate. It meant that in 1912, Germany, having never actually intended on building any ships secretly, had 13 dreadnoughts in commission. Great Britain had 22. Tirpitz's dream had ended in nightmare. What of the Germans then? The preeminent English language historian of the German Navy, Holger Herwig, summed up Tirpitz's choice to build dreadnoughts as follows. It speaks volumes for the nature of the decision-making process in Germany that the British challenge was accepted without input from the Chancery, the Foreign Office, the Treasury, or the 2 agencies directly responsible for strategic naval planning, the Admiralty Staff and the High Seas Fleet. Yet like in Britain, there was undoubtedly a large section of the German public which supported the naval programme. For many in the Reichstag, the meritocratic recruitment of the Navy's officer corps was a welcome change to the still aristocrat-dominated army. Likewise, the Naval League, founded to advocate for fleet expansion among the German public, numbered over 1 million people at one point. None of this though could change the extraordinary cost of trying to maintain the greatest army and second greatest navy in the world. The man meant to find the money for Wilhelm and Tirpitz's schemes was the Chancellor, Bernhard von Bulow. Of all Imperial Germany's chancellors, Bulow was by far the most able in that one all-important responsibility, getting along with the Kaiser. More courtier than statesman, it was said he possessed every quality except greatness. He'd been born the son of a Mecklenburg nobleman who rose to serve as foreign minister under Bismarck between 1873 and 1879. Bulow, after fighting in the Franco-Prussian War, had unsurprisingly climbed high in his father's ministry. He was intelligent, spoke several languages fluently, and had a good grasp of foreign affairs. Most of all, he was charming, witty, and the most scandalous flatterer in all Europe. The reality though was that Bulow's personality was a dark one. In Massey's words, the facade was splendid, behind lay the driving forces of Bulow's life, vanity and ambition. The characteristics of his work were laziness and cynicism. He grappled ruthlessly for power, but once it was in his possession, he ignored his duties, despised details, and left his subordinates to find their own way. After a series of successful ambassadorships, Bulow was appointed foreign minister and finally offered the ultimate prize of the chancellorship in 1900. "Now, what about my ships?" Wilhelm immediately asked after Bulow accepted the foreign office. Publicly, Bulow was perfectly happy to serve as a vessel for Wilhelm's idea of personal rule, carrying out his master's often eccentric commands without the nagging and opposition that had accompanied Caprivi and Hohenlohe. Whenever, by oversight, he expresses an opinion in disagreement with the Emperor, he remains silent for a few moments, then says the exact contrary with the preface, "As your Majesty so wisely remarked," noted one observer. Of course, whilst Bulow had few of his own ideas, he was wise enough to pass between the good, the bad and the bizarre from the Kaiser. Usually he was free to choose which ones he liked, knowing Wilhelm would either forget or change his mind about the others anyway. A German fleet, Bulow originally thought, was a good idea. "We do not want to put anyone in our shadow, but we also demand our place in the sun," he had declared before the Reichstag in 1897. A powerful fleet was the only way Germany could hope to engage in Weltpolitik, world politics. And so, each time the navy needed expanding, Bulow would go before the Reichstag and with his eloquence make the case for the increase. By 1908 though, the Chancellor was becoming increasingly sceptical. Like in Britain, the cost of the naval race was astronomical, and politicians, particularly on the left in the Reichstag, were becoming ever more restless. The basic truth was that Berlin had none of the essentials to compete with Britain in the naval sphere. Its shipbuilding industry, though capable of learning remarkably quickly, lacked the capacity and expertise. Germany had a poorer population and a scarcity of capital compared to the British. Bulow's attempts to assuage this by implementing a federal income tax in 1909 ended in a humiliating failure. The result was that Germany usually resorted to borrowing to fund the naval increases, doubling the national debt in 8 years. Most worryingly of all, the navy hoovered up cash that could have gone to the army. Berlin was encircled by the second and third most powerful armies in the world, yet was spending a third of its military budget on a single-purpose fleet to blackmail a nation who until then had been no threat at all. Worse, the race showed no signs of slowing. At times, Tirpitz hinted that a programme of 60 battleships, replaceable at the rate of 3 a year, was the minimum he aspired to. "When will you be sufficiently advanced with your fleet?" Bulow bluntly asked Tirpitz in 1907, "so that the unbearable political situation will be relieved?" The answer was it wouldn't. Throughout 1908, an increasingly worn-out Chancellor struggled to find a way of raising the required revenue, only to see his efforts then cancelled out by the enormous British programme ordered in 1909. By that time though, Bulow was politically dead anyway. In August 1908, Wilhelm met Edward VII in Kronberg. The Kaiser did not like his uncle, probably because Bertie was everything Willie was not. Self-assured, well-liked by the royal courts of Europe and respected internationally, his philandering and unsnobbish consorting with Jews and lower classes also rankled Wilhelm. Nonetheless, the atmosphere this time was cordial. Edward had been given a document highlighting points about the ongoing arms race to try and address with the Kaiser, but chose not to spoil the pleasant atmosphere. Hardinge, permanent undersecretary at the Foreign Office, was franker when he met Wilhelm for drinks after dinner. The naval race, Hardinge warned, was permanently souring Anglo-German relations. The Kaiser, though, would have none of it. Anglo-German relations, he thought, had never been better. Hardinge, one of the less avowedly anti-German diplomats that surrounded Grey, was deeply alarmed by Wilhelm's flippant attitude towards the race, but the Kaiser typically came away believing the meeting had been a great personal triumph and that he had proved the righteousness of his cause to the British. Events were to say otherwise. On the 28th of October 1908, the Daily Telegraph published what it described as an interview with Wilhelm. In fact, the article was really a write-up of notes handed to the paper by a credulous and Germanophile English landowner who had hosted the Kaiser the previous year, and thought Wilhelm's unguarded opinions, stated to him over a few brandies, would clear away all misunderstandings if published publicly. The Telegraph sent the article to the Kaiser first for review. Wilhelm, acting within official guidelines for once, passed it on to Bulow, and Bulow passed it on to the Foreign Office. Unfortunately, midway through this game of pass the parcel, the music stopped. With no edits received, the Telegraph published the full interview to immediate outrage on both sides of the North Sea. In tone, the Kaiser appeared both self-pitying and accusatory. The British were as mad as March hares for rejecting his personal offers of friendship. They were fools for opposing the German naval build-up, which was actually aimed at Japan. Most Germans disliked the English, and Wilhelm's own friendly attitude put him in the distinct minority. It was he that had come up with the operational plan to defeat the Boers. This obviously made Wilhelm sound like both a villain and a moron. The contradiction was so bizarre that no one quite knew what to make of it. Crow, who ironically might have been the one man in Europe that still thought the German Emperor competent, announced the interview was a ploy to lure Britain into a false sense of security. "The German Kaiser is aging me," Grey complained. "He's like a battleship with steam up and screws going, but with no rudder. He will run into something someday and cause a catastrophe." The interview caused a scandal in Germany as well. Only a year earlier, Wilhelm's close friend Philipp Eulenburg had been exposed as a homosexual, illegal in Germany at that point, and this subsequent humiliation tipped the Kaiser into a deep depression. For the first time, he seriously considered abdicating. In the end, he did not, coming instead, not wholly unfairly, to blame Bulow for the debacle. In July 1909, the Chancellor offered his resignation, which was accepted. If nothing else, the affair served to highlight the growing wedge the naval arms race was driving between Britain and Germany. There was some justice to the Kaiser's complaints that Whitehall regarded the German navy with unique prejudice, and that the British press's vituperative attacks on him and his nation were excessive. Yet these complaints were, equally, somewhat disingenuous. Of course a battle fleet with a composition meant for fighting in the North Sea was going to raise more alarm in Britain than a Japanese or American naval programme. It's true that Britain then made more of the threat than was necessary. Had the Cordiale programme been maintained, there would have been no naval scare, nor much of a naval race to speak of. Even so, the British reaction was ultimately understandable. The Germans were to react the exact same way, if anything more hysterically, to the Russian armament programme on land a few years hence. In the latter race though, which we'll discuss in more detail later, it was not exactly clear who was going to win. On the seas, it was always apparent that Britain, if seriously threatened, could outbuild the Germans indefinitely. Tirpitz's only answer to this unalterable law of nature was that the British would eventually blink first under the financial strain, and that too much had already been gambled to leave the house empty-handed now. And so, two nations that fundamentally had very few conflicting interests went into the new decade in one of the most intense arms races in modern times, just as Europe was about to be thrown once more to the brink of war.